Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 30th meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2025. Our first item of business this morning is a decision on taking items 5, 6 and 7 in private. Item 5 is the consideration of the evidence that we will have heard today on transport. Item 6 is the consideration of the committee's work programme, and item 7 is consideration of our approach to the Stage 1 scrutiny of the Ecocide Scotland Bill. Now, in order to ensure we carefully adhere to the Parliament's standing orders, I'm going to split this bit into two questions. First, I'll ask whether we are agreed on taking items 5 and 6 in private. Then I'll ask if we're agreed, and then I will ask if we're going to take item 7 in private, noting that Monica Lennon may not participate in that part of the decision process. This is purely because she is the member in charge of that bill. I'm not going to quote the relevant rule at you, but I'm sure you've all looked it up as I have. I hope that's all clear. So the first question is, are we agreed to take item 5 and 6 in private? We are agreed. With Monica Lennon recusing herself from the following decision, are we also agreed to take item 7 in private? We are agreed. Good. Our second item of business is an evidence session with the Scottish Government on their transport policies and performance. This is an opportunity for the committee to pick up on themes discussed with bus, train and ferry stakeholders in meetings earlier this year and on visits. There are other issues within the Cabinet Secretary's wide-ranging we may wish to discuss this morning. This includes the decarbonisation the sector, an issue the committee will be returning to later this year when it takes evidence on the transport chapter of the forthcoming climate change plan. I welcome to the meeting Fiona Hislop, the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Fiona Brown, the Director of Transport Strategy and Analysis, Chris Wilcock, the Director of Ferries and Ports, and Bill Reid, the Director of Rail Reform Transport Scotland. Thank you all for attending this morning. And I try this every time. I'm going to invite you, Cabinet Secretary, to make some short opening remarks. One day I'll get my wish.
I always oblige, Convener. And thank you to you, Convener, and to the committee for inviting me to today's session. I have tried to keep the committee informed by correspondence on various significant developments on a regular basis, and I'll set out some of the key achievements of the Scottish Government in these brief opening remarks. The National Transport Strategy's vision and priorities remain central to policy and decision-making for the Scottish Government, as well as the focus of our regional transport partnerships and a wide range of organisations. And we need this to continue, and this collaborative approach is key to delivering public transport provision for the people of Scotland, helping them to access services, education, employment and leisure in a more sustainable way. And encouraging people to use public transport is fundamental to our vision. And to support this, there are a number of commitments delivered and developments to improve connectivity, accessibility, affordability I'd like to highlight. We have introduced free inter-island ferry travel for young people and expanded the concessionary ferry voucher scheme to include islanders aged 19 to 21. The free rail travel pilot for companions for blind people has also been introduced, and we're working to launch the pilot scheme for free bus travel for people seeking asylum, as well as a bus fare cap to be trialled in one of our regions. Peak fares, as you well know, have been abolished across ScotRail services, and we've opened new rail stations at Hairmyres and East Kilbride, with the wider East Kilbride enhancement project set to deliver electrification by the end of the year. And there have been a number of port infrastructure improvements supporting resilience for our communities. The strategic approach to the Islands Connectivity Plan and the Vessels and Ports Plan for Clyde and Hebrides and Northern Isles networks were published in May, and the direct award for the Clyde and Hebrides ferry contract to Calmac Ferries was delivered last week. The new arrangements will see almost £4 billion of public funding investment over 10 years, moving from that commercial arrangement to a model fully focused on delivering a public service for the communities that depend on these ferry services. Work is also ongoing to prepare and develop the Northern Isles ferry service 4 contract, with services to be procured by the 30th of June 2028. And following her recent successful sea trials, MV Isle of Isla will be handed over to CMAL by November, and I look forward to seeing her service on the Kennecraig to Isla route. On major projects, the £152.7 million construction contract was awarded for the 4th section of the A9 dualling programme between Tay Crossing and Ballinnuig. We've published the A96 Corridor Review Report and consultation, and we've engaged with local communities on resilience work ongoing for the A83, as work has continued on the short, medium and long-term solutions. And one of my main concerns has been safety on our roads, and through the Road Safety Improvement Fund, £10 million has been allocated to councils for initiatives that address safety concerns across the local road network. On bus and accessible travel, we've invested further in zero-emission buses. We've recently awarded over £26 million for active travel infrastructure construction projects across Scotland, establishing a working group to tackle antisocial behaviour, and recently welcomed 2 major bus operators to the National Smart Ticketing Advisory Board. And we've announced £4.5 million of funding for rural and island EV charging, and launched the Cross-Pavement Charging Grant Pilot programme, and £20 million is also being provided to encourage and enable more households and businesses with lower incomes to purchase electric vehicles. We've also established the HGV Market Readiness Fund to provide £2 million to support collaboration to identify investment in HGV decarbonisation. We've published our aviation statement, which outlines the specific actions we'll take to encourage decarbonisation and increase international connectivity. And of course, as you'll be aware, we've faced many challenges across all modes. We continue to work together with partners to take forward a range of vital steps to address and deliver our commitments. And finally, earlier this year, we published our Value of Transport report, which provides a broad framework for understanding and illustrating how transport contributes to Scotland's growing economy, and it's a useful resource for decision makers, both locally and nationally, to draw on. So I understand the committee is eager to explore many of these issues and others further. So that's my remarks, Convener, and I look forward to answering questions from the committee.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I should just point out that Mark Ruskell is going to be joining us, but he's held up due to transport issues, which I'm sure you won't be delighted to hear, but he'll be joining us for questions later on. So the first questions come from Monica Lennon. Monica.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary and the rest of our panel. Today, that was a helpful opening statement, Cabinet Secretary. Good to hear some positive measures in there. It was nice to see you, of course, in Here Myers recently for the new station, and you mentioned the abolition of peak fares and expansion of concessionary travel, which I certainly welcome. But it's been 5 years now since the publication of the National Transport Strategy 2, and the clear aim was to tackle inequality, reduce emissions and drive economic growth. So I wonder if you can say a word or two about how successful its implementation has been, because we have seen bus and train use go down in that period. There's been no significant rise in walking and cycling, and you did mention safety, but the number of fatalities on our roads have remained largely static for the last few years. So how successful is NTS2?
So National Transport Strategy 2 is a very important document launched by one of my predecessors. I think I recognise Mr Matheson at this point, but a really important document that actually brings the sector together. And I think what was quite striking, we had a transport summit recently with a focus on the value of transport document I've just referred to. And it was quite remarkable the number of people that said, right from across the sector, operators as well as from regional transport authorities, local authorities, that actually that pulls everything together. It gives everybody that guidance of what they need to try and produce. There are individual projects within that, but you outlined quite correctly the general approach on that. On bus and train, we are seeing an increase in uptake. Of course, 5 years, if you go back, obviously covers the COVID pandemic period. Some modes have been more rapid at returning than others. I think train came back more quickly than bus. Bus had been a problem, particularly for older people, but if I may share with you that currently we're dealing with the kind of pressures on the concessionary scheme, where actually we're now starting to see older people come back to bus, and that obviously puts pressure on our budgeting in terms of its demand-led. So we can tell by the kind of uptake from that that's improved. So I think it's wrong to say that, you know, there's a problem because it hasn't returned to pre-COVID levels, because in some cases they have done. I think we're going to start seeing reports from this year that we are on that trajectory. And of course, abolishing peak rail fares that's part of trying to encourage more people who haven't used rail before to use rail. So in terms of where we are with that, I think we've done, I think, well in terms of that recovery with working with our operators. In terms of road safety, I absolutely agree. I've got concerns around road safety, but I managed to increase the budget in difficult times for road safety, both nationally and locally. There are obviously differences between local fatalities, and we're obviously concerned about trunk road fatalities. In terms of those, I get reports on every single one of those deaths, and that I think is very salutary to remind ourselves of what those issues are. We have managed now to go back to increasing our budget on advertising or to deploy it. Speeding is an issue. One of the serious concerns I have is the fatalities where people have not been wearing the seatbelts. So in terms of the impact of collisions, obviously if you're not wearing a seatbelt, there's more likelihood that you'll die, and it's well over 20% of people who die on our roads have not been wearing seatbelts. So that in and of itself is an issue. Distracted driver, we're tackling that. We're also working, I chair the road safety programme. I can provide, I'm just quite a long answer, but we can provide more detail to the committee if they're interested in the actions of the road safety programme. We have got researchers working between Transport Scotland and Police Scotland to make sure that we can hone in on where the issues are. We're doing a lot of work with motorcyclists in a cooperative way, but also with the signage on roads to help with our particular bends and how they should approach them, etc. That's one of the successful elements of that. But we're also identifying when and where there are clearly issues. August, which is actually interesting, not our school holidays, but obviously in terms of the time when it's obviously good weather, etc. In terms of how we tackle that. So there are a whole range of different issues. Road safety is not just, a lot of people think road safety is about the conditions of roads. There's very few instances where it's the conditions of roads that have led to the fatality. Often it can be driver behaviour. That's very difficult to talk about when people are grieving and they've got families. But obviously distracted driver behaviour is one of the things that we've got real concerns about. And that's something that we're also trying to address in terms of some of the camera work and developments that are coming in place. And we're also developing with Police Scotland the desk aspect, which I know a number of members are interested in. That's dash cam that can be uploaded that can help people learn about different experiences. So it's something that's getting really full attention from me and my colleagues.
Thank you. There's a lot there that I think colleagues will return to. I certainly will come back with questions on bus later. But this issue of safety, I think if we just think about the local context, I'll leave aside the trunk roads for now, but I think we all represent communities who have real concerns. You mentioned funding, Cabinet Secretary, and I can think of some local examples right now in Lanarkshire. I won't go into all the detail, the convener will be pleased, but I can think of different examples where there's real frustration on behalf of communities who feel that they're raising concerns about accidents and what they would call near misses, but often they're told this is not as dangerous as other roads, or decisions are made out with the local authority. I think there's a role for, is it Safety Cameras Scotland? So is it about funding? Is it about attitude to risk? You did mention driver behaviour, and it's good to hear there's more being done around the education part and some of the advertising that you mentioned. But for communities who are worried quite now, who are hearing perhaps from a local authority or the police that other roads are more dangerous, there's nothing to worry about, but they're trying to get their kids to school in the morning, or an older person who's not feeling confident to get out, what can you say to reassure them?
So clearly local roads are under the responsibility of the local authority, and so therefore in terms of how they deploy their resources and funding, in terms of identifying if there are particular areas, I think it's little known that local authorities, if they have got concerns, for example, of excess speeding in a particular area, can request for a period of time for that to be monitored. So that's something that we need to make sure, and we do make sure local authorities know about. They don't often necessarily use that facility. I think local junctions quite often can be a concern around sightage, sighting around local junctions. Again, local authorities can look at, and again, it's about, I know from your experience as a planner, you'll be very familiar with this, in terms of designs of different junctions and how they can use that. That's where some of the national national funding for road safety can be used to help that. And of course, we're also looking and seeing the rollout of 20 miles per hour in our cities and towns and across Scotland, and that will make a difference because we know again survival rates of from in terms of you're 7 times more likely to survive, I think, at 20 miles per hour if you're hit with that around 30 miles per hour. So again, in terms of that also is helping contribute, and we're supporting local authorities in that rollout as well. So these are all things that we can help the local authorities with, but they also have to identify what they need. And we've got a very good relationship. Scots, who are the local authorities' transport leads, also sit on the National Road Safety Partnership, and we're working very closely with them to share good experience. I think it's fair to say there's different approaches in local authorities. So what we're trying to do is help bring that together in terms of best practice, but that really has to be led with COSLA. And I'm very pleased that the Transport Lead Councillor Gail McGregor is now attending those road safety partnerships. So COSLA and also Scots are very much part. That's why I'm saying it's a partnership. We can't do everything for local authorities in their own area, but that's a type of thing that can be done.
Back to more strategic matters. The second strategic transport projects review identified a series of major public transport projects as a priority of investment, including the Glasgow Metro, the Aberdeen Rapid Transit and a South East Scotland mass transit system. Can you give us an update on how the Scottish Government is supporting the development of these projects, and is the Government committed to funding their construction?
Clearly, these are big and major and strategic projects. The Glasgow Metro scheme is being led by Strathclyde Partnership in terms of SBT's lead in putting together what's required from a business case. You'll know also from your experience in this committee that business cases have to be presented if there's also then the annual approach for national funding, etc. In terms of the Aberdeen Transit, in terms of those developments, obviously Aberdeen has led in many ways in terms of using their bus aspects in relation to transit. And obviously from the south of Scotland there's less, that third one I've got less familiarity with in terms of it's not come to me in terms of the stage that it's at. In fact, all of these projects are still some distance away, and they would need to come to us in terms of their business case development to look for national funding. But obviously I know that local authorities themselves will be identifying what funding they have to bring, and also since they're longer term projects, what financial mechanisms they might want to deploy with the powers that they have of borrowing in different other areas to help finance the rollout of that. But obviously that the consideration of that is really important. There's a lot of advisory work goes on in terms of that, and Transport Scotland can and do provide that advice. There's a lot of planning work. And indeed, I was having a debrief from the National Census just the other day, and they were telling me about the statistics and the information they have on a very micro level that's helping inform the plans for the Glasgow Metro.
And just briefly, are you happy with the progress being made? Because you said it sounds like it's quite a long way off with some of the projects.
Well, I think it's really important to understand that these are locally led. By the regional transport partnerships. That's where the place for the regional partnership, and that one particularly is Glasgow Metro.
Are you happy with the pace?
I mean, they're not accountable to me. Okay, we've set out we've set out what the kind of the plans are and what the projects are and what the priorities are in terms of where we will support. But it's very important. This is not a command and control aspect in relation to.
Oh no, I understand that.
So.
I just wondered if you're happy with the pace of.
I'm content if they're content. Is basically my answer.
Okay. Well, we can ask them. Yeah. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, and there's a few supplementaries on the back of what we've just discussed. Going to go to Mark first, followed by Kevin.
Yeah, thank you. Apologies, I was slightly late for the meeting. I want to just come back on the issue of speed limits. It's very welcome to see 20 mile an hour being rolled out across Scotland now, but will the target of ensuring that all appropriate roads are 20 mile an hour by the end of this year be met, or are we seeing a kind of staggered implementation? That was one question. The other question then about the change in the national speed limit on single carriageway roads, so reducing the speed limit for most vehicles, but then increasing the speed limit slightly for HGVs. Is that still on track? What's the feedback been on that?
So on that latter point, there's extensive feedback, as you can imagine. Obviously, there are different types of single carriageway rural roads, and obviously we need to consider very closely what that will actually mean in practice. And specifically, for example, there's certain roads that I think that needs further engagement in particular. In relation to HGVs, there's a general consensus in terms of what we can do with HGVs in terms of changing their speed limit. But otherwise, in terms of I want to consider that properly, and I've not had that. I have not had the report and the consultation as yet, but I'm looking forward to receiving that.
Could you just give us the time frame for that so people know?
There's never, so it's not, when you say on track, there was never a time frame as to when that would happen.
Well, you must have a time frame in your brain. Is it going to be done before the dissolution of the Parliament, or is it?
I think, well, on the basis that it will require regulations, etc., on the basis that your committee is extremely busy, as I know, but I don't think we'll have time necessarily to do what we would need to do. But I certainly want to make sure that in terms of when I've received the responses to the consultation, I can take a view and inform the incoming government as to what they might want to do. I'm not, in terms of timescales, I can't give you a definitive one, but I'm very conscious that to effect some of these aspects, it will require legislation.
So, sorry, just push you a bit more on that. The consultation is closed,
Yes.
is closed?
Consultation is closed. There's a great deal of responses, so we're having...
So how long will it take you to publish those responses? Because you'll want a summary. I mean, we're going to get all the climate change responses, climate change plan responses within a month, we're told. So you must be able to pull this back within a month, surely, and publish a summary of the responses?
I'm not in a position at this time to tell you how long that will take, convener, and I would be making it up if I did, and I don't do that.
Okay. Well, we don't like making it up. Perhaps you could write to the committee when you've had a chance to consider that. I think it would be helpful. Sorry, back to Mark.
Yeah,
Sorry,
and
Mark.
so the other issues around...
Well, just before, I mean, the timescales are important because the quicker we can make changes that have got an evidence base to them that they'll save lives, the quicker we can save lives. So, there's an important point there. Sorry.
Okay. You also asked about the 20 miles per hour. There are plans by all the local authorities have set out how they're going to do this, and clearly in many areas that is that's already rolled out, and in many areas they're a wee bit slower. I think my own local area of West Lothian, I think, is slower than perhaps other areas. But in terms of the consent, I think what's really important, though, and we know that from the kind of history of moving to 20 miles per hour in different parts of the UK, that actually the consensus around doing this is very strong at local level and on a cross-party basis. And I can see that rolling out. So I'm confident they will be rolled out and rolled out effectively. By the end of the year, for every single local authority. I can't take responsibility for every single one of those local authorities, but I know the vast majority, as we all know, are well on their way to delivery of that.
Will that message of when you're in town, slow down, will that be reinforced by national communications? Because obviously in Wales we've seen 25% reduction in casualties as a result of the national rollout. That's partly been because it's been very high profile and the government's put a lot of money into messaging and telling people why this is here rather than, oh, I noticed that my speed limit's dropped, I'm not sure why. So is there anything to reinforce this now as we get towards a point where the whole of Scotland has got 20, where it makes sense to put it?
So any kind of national rollout of communications like that will need to be done in conjunction with, as I mentioned, with our road safety partnership colleagues, with COSLA and with Scots. But I think you're correct in terms of that awareness. I think actually by and large people are very aware because they're seeing the signage and seeing the changes. The importance of it, I think, can and should be reinforced. And I think those road casualty figures recognising, I think, also the questions of Monica Lennon in terms of road safety. I mean, this is on a local basis, but if you've got a 25% reduction in casualties, it's not always in town fatalities, but it can be severe injuries. So I think in terms of seeing that happen, I think the consensus of that is really, really important, and that's what we're seeing rolled out. But I will make sure that when our next meeting of the Road Safety Partnership, we reinforce the point that the committees of review, if you are collectively, that actually looking at how we nationally reinforce that in terms of communications may be helpful.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Having visited the Banffshire coast the other week, just a week after the 20 mile per hour areas came into play in Portsoy and Banff and Macduff, you could see a real difference in behaviours very, very quickly. And I think the vast bulk of the folk that I spoke to while I was there were very favourable to that introduction. I recognise that these matters and those safety matters in local roads are a matter for local authorities. But I wonder, Cabinet Secretary, in terms of good practice, local authorities that continue, for example, to conduct regular area traffic management plans, which include safety features. I wonder if you have spoken to COSLA, to the Regional Transport Partnership and partnerships and others, to see if that best practice can actually be exported right across Scotland.
So that was one of the areas that we discussed at the last road safety partnership group that I chaired just probably a few weeks past, where that was one of the areas that our colleagues in COSLA and I'm trying to remember the second name, but Colin, I will update the name from our colleagues that work with the local leads in terms of road traffic management, that road safety is dealt with. I don't want to say that some local authorities don't take it seriously, because I think all local authorities take it seriously. But I think some local authorities are more organised in how they're managing that and have a higher profile in terms of the how that's viewed within the local authority itself. One of the other areas that road policing were quite keen on as well was to make sure that it is seen within the context of community planning partnerships. Yeah. And perhaps in some areas it's got a higher profile and importance. I think what's really interesting, and the reports from COSLA, is when their relevant committees have engaged on road safety, there's a great deal of enthusiasm by the local councillors who sit on that committee. So I think there's a real appetite to really drive this forward. But I think you're right in terms of the best practice, and I'm not in the position to say what the best practice is, but I think in terms of that collaborative work, our Scots leads and our local authority leads and our COSLA leads, that's one of the things they want to do in a supportive environment. It's not saying that people aren't doing things that they can do. Sometimes it is about the resource and attention that's put on that. But there's a great keenness to use the funding that we're providing nationally also to help them. And also, interestingly, we've recently appointed somebody from Public Health Scotland to be part of the road safety performance, because obviously it's a public health issue as well, and people quite often see road safety in terms of construction and in terms of the roads, but increasingly it's actually about how people are behaving, how the traffic is managed, that can make a difference. And so I think your points are very well made, and again I'll feed that back to the Road Safety Partnership.
I wonder, Cabinet Secretary, on the issue of funding for this, and local authorities always say that they're strapped for cash. Is there an opportunity for local authorities to look at fines from LEZs or from bus gates to actually fund some of those road safety schemes? Is that featured in the discussions that you've had with COSLA? Is that something that can maybe be opened up for further debate, knowing, of course, that this is not directly in your control?
So the legislation around LEZs and what it can be used for is very tight, and it is specifically for air quality and for enhancement of specific areas, and that's governed by law, so that can't be used, as some people think, for anything within council, just the choice and whims. So that's kind of put that one to bed. In terms of funding the canoes, I mean, some local authorities, including my own, don't even have powers over penalty charges that they could be reinvesting into roads. So there's different experiences in different parts of the country. I think there's no one magic bullet on road safety. I think the whole point is everybody can contribute something. So one of the areas we're also pursuing is on road policing, and there was a very important and I think constructive but challenging and HMIC report into road policing. They are changing what they are doing, and that will become obvious in public when they, at their point when they want to publish that. But the reason that's important is quite often you might see local authorities saying, well, the local road policing is not as it has been, or they have criticisms of that. So therefore, that's an excuse for them not to do anything. Whereas what we're trying to do is to get everybody to do more, and then I think if everybody does more, we'll start to have more of an impact on our roads.
Maybe that cooperation is something that could occur at the CPP level.
Well, that's where that was an interesting contribution from road policing on that issue.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I'm glad we're not opening up the debate about LEZ and how the money can be used. I remember that in the Transport Scotland Bill when it went through the committee I was on. It was quite heated at the time. So move on. What? It was. We agree, Michael. Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I thought I would ask about the current position of the Scottish Government in relation to car usage. I'm conscious that in 2020 there was an ambition to reduce car kilometres travelled by 20%, and that this year there was a renewed policy statement in partnership with COSLA, which still wishes to tackle car usage but had no specific target within it. That might be perhaps a reflection on the Climate Change Committee advice that we got this year that modelled a required reduction in car usage for carbon budgets of 6% by 2035, which is very different from the 2020 target. So it would be helpful for the committee to understand what the Scottish Government's current ambition is in relation to reduction in car usage.
So the original target of this 20% of car use reduction by 2030 was set at a time actually around the pandemic when there was a substantial reduction in car use, and there wasn't an anticipation it would come back to previous levels. As you may recall, I took quite a bit of flack for recognising in the I think it was in the summer period that this is one, not achievable, but also may not be needed and what is going to be required in the future. Now, of course, the reason I had to make that clear at that time, because Audit Scotland had done a report at that point, what I think we all knew was that the Climate Change Committee's advice was going to be quite way off what we were expecting was going to be needed when those original targets were set. So the fact that the UK Climate Change Committee in its recent advice, Scotland's carbon budgets, indicates that Scotland would now need that 6% modal shift from car to public transport and active travel by 2035, as you've stated, is a big difference from what was there originally. So one of the things that I'm currently doing is revising what we are going to be producing. We'll need to do that as part of the climate change plan. I know this committee has spent a lot of time looking at what might be anticipated from that. One of the things we'll need to look at is whether it's, and I've got a submission that I'm ready to look at any time now on the basis that we're obviously preparing for the climate change publication. We need to look at whether it's car use or indeed car emission reduction, because obviously what we're trying to do with car use reduction is reduce emissions. So we'll look at what's the appropriate measure. And clearly, one of the issues that we had previously was obviously with, again, going back to this partnership aspect, COSLA are really key in this, and we're not anticipating all parts of the country being able to do the same level and degree of change. Our cities will be in advance, perhaps, of other areas. We will always need car use in rural areas. I've been quite clear as the Transport Secretary that I anticipate that. Where I think there is a bit of a challenge is the Climate Change Committee's view is that there'll be limited car use reduction because effectively people will just move from petrol, diesel to EVs, and it will just, in terms of there'll be limited reduction in cars full stop, but most of them, in fact all of them, will be EVs. I think that's ambitious. I think we're going to have to consider what we will need to do to meet our carbon budgets. So I think the 6% is one low, but also I think in terms of the measure, the emissions, we need to think about how it impacts on emissions. But there are other reasons why we'd want to encourage car use reduction generally by encouraging public transport use. And also we know that that's actually a healthier way in terms of walking, wheeling, cycling to use public transport as well. In some part of the country, quite clearly, we need to have continuing extensive car use, and that can be EV, but as we're very aware that we need to make sure that we've got the charging infrastructure that meets the requirement, which is why, as I've said to the committee before, we've got the £30 million out with local authorities to develop that, and also that new additional rural and islands EV fund, because the market won't necessarily support charging structure in some of our rural and island areas. So it is difficult, it's complex. There's a world of difference from what the Climate Change Committee are now saying compared to previously, and what I will need to do is make sure that we present to everyone in terms of the climate change plan what that new target's going to be.
I mean, of course, Cabinet Secretary will get more information when the climate change plan is published on a kind of sectoral basis across portfolio, but I'm conscious that 6% reduction, if I've got this right, predicated by the UK Climate Change Committee is a 6% reduction in anticipated growth in car usage rather than a reduction in kilometres. So I'm just wondering at this stage, are you in a position to say whether or not the Scottish Government's position would be to see less kilometres travelled by car, or constraining the growth in kilometres travelled in cars? But I'm conscious you also mentioned it's about reducing emissions as much as about kilometres.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the point is about emissions, and you could have the same number of cars and increase car use. If they're all EVs, you can see an increase in terms of the use of cars, but a reduction in the use of emissions. Now, I think we need to ensure that whatever is produced in our plans reflect what Scotland's needs are likely to be, and I do still think that we need a shift and encouragement of use of public transport, which is one of the reasons why we have removed the peak fares for good, because it will take it'll take some time to deliver that full modal shift and people making that decision. So in terms of what's required, we'll set that out in the climate change plan. We indicated in the June statement at the time of the extract from the policy statement accompanying the carbon budgets in June, some of the areas that we'll be working on in terms of the transport aspect. So you'll have the transport chapter of the plan when it's published.
Okay, so it's kind of wait and see whether it's less kilometres or not. We'll have to wait for the climate change plan to
I am actively in consideration of what that will look like. I'm not in a position to tell the committee just now, but it'll be set out in the
more generally then, my final question would be, you mentioned, which was quite helpful, that there's an appreciation that remote and rural areas, cars are an absolute lifeline and necessity for many reasons, even with enhanced public transport in those areas. So should we expect any constraints in the growth of car usage to be more predominant within our urban areas? And could you give some examples of what current actions the Scottish Government is taking, notwithstanding the new plan that will be published shortly, I would imagine, to reduce car usage or to switch to public transport?
So when I made it clear that we're going to have to change our targets in this area, what we did do was, again, together with COSLA, set out a policy statement of the different actions that we've taken place. One of the proposals in that, and I think it's the right and appropriate one, is that there would be regional transport partnerships, and on a local basis will set out what they'll be doing to try and help tackle emissions and obviously car use as well, and to encourage public transport. We also said that we would have a regulatory check on what was the Labour legislation on road user charging. That's up to local authorities if they want to use that or not. And we're establishing a group that will look at whether that legislation is still fit for purpose if MD wanted to use it. And that would be the regulatory check aspect of the then Transport, I think, 2001 legislation.
Okay. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks, Bob. Back to you, Mark, for some more questions.
Yeah, so just to continue in that vein, in terms of the plans that you would expect local authorities to come up with, particularly the urban local authorities, where they're obviously going to need to try and have a target in mind for traffic reduction, what kind of measures would you support? I mean, would you support traffic demand management measures within that? If a council came forward with some form of congestion charging or workplace parking, would that be something that, if a council came to Scottish Government and said, we want to do this, can you support us? Can you help us explain the benefits of this? Can you help us with the modelling of it? How What would be the response from the Scottish Government on that?
So again, this is local decision making, and I'm not going to do a command and control to say what they should or shouldn't do. It would be up to them to decide what they want to do. Obviously, they've got legislative provision, whether it's in the transport legislation from 2001 or indeed the 2019 legislation, although I think it's interesting that maybe it is because of what's obviously happened in terms of fewer people coming into the cities to work in terms of commuting, and that's reflecting perhaps Monica Lennon's point about in terms of commuting use, if we're still seeing significant numbers. And in fact, the census information was quite interesting about the levels there, about a third of people still working from home. And again, that was obviously taken in 2022, that obviously the changes for workplace levy, for example, those circumstances have changed, and we don't see any local authorities looking at that. The local authorities are, the Labour Transport Lead in Edinburgh is quite keen that we don't roll back from anything, because he was concerned about a reduction in the targets, as if that would have an impact on them. It doesn't. It allows them to carry on to do what they want to do. And some local authorities are more keen than others that we look at the regulatory review and we set that up so they can see what they might want to do. I think my advice to them is to make sure you've got good, strong public transport alternatives. And obviously in Edinburgh City, we know that the Lothian bus system is a strong and respected and very popular system. I think their challenge will be about what happens to the likes of East Lothian, Mid Lothian, etc., and West Lothian, and indeed the mass transport. Going back to the strategic transport plans that were set out previously, it was in Lothians it was a mass transit. It doesn't necessarily specify one particular mode, etc., but it's got to be across the region, not just for one city. So so I think that's a challenge. Generally, I suspect, for our cities is not so much what they want to do internally within their own cities, but how do they work with neighbouring local authorities to make sure that everybody has the benefits. So I think having a good, positive alternative to, in the form of public transport for people to use would be a requirement from that. So we're there to enable, to support where we can, but we would need to have to respond to any proposals that come forward. There's no firm proposals, I think, that I've seen as yet, but I mean that's the general atmosphere. So we're doing what we need to do to make sure that the regulatory checks are in place for certain things that they want to use this provision there if they need to if they want to use legislation. But in terms of what they do, they have to really decide themselves. I can't decide that for them.
I mean, I appreciate that the design of any schemes needs to be a very, very local decision. There'll be local factors. But isn't there an issue here, though, in terms of the uncertainty that creates? Because you've now got a climate change plan that does have a big hole in it. Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero has said that transport will be filling that hole. So there'll be an acceleration of actions on transport. But if many of those are being delivered at the local level, and it's effectively up to councils to decide whether they're going to put in congestion charging or demand management, isn't there a danger here that actually major projects don't come forward? Things that you're relying on in the climate change plan don't come forward because councils are reluctant to do that, and we just end up with a big black hole again in terms of carbon emissions. How are we going to fill that? We can't fill that completely with EVs. There has to be new innovative policy there. So how can you ensure that the action is going to be taken at local level? Projects are going to come through, policies are going to be enacted, if it's all to do with local councils?
Right, so I think I'm not sure I reflect or accept the analysis that you've given, because there's two aspects to it. I mean, you're very familiar with this in terms of what is inbuilt to the existing climate change, in terms of what we're expecting in terms of emission reduction, and then there's what do we do next to obviously deliver what will be the stretch targets of the Climate Change Committee's budgets. And it's the stretch targets and it's additional. So a lot of what you've reflected on is already built into changes, and that's about demand reduction. Demand reduction can come in different shapes and sizes. Some of it actually, a lot of it, and most of it will be driven by the EV mandates that's reserved to the UK government in terms of that shift from the sale of new cars to be EV as opposed to any others. That's an agreement that obviously we do on a four-nation basis with the UK government. So the big driver for that existing kind of change, or the existing plans, is driven by the EV mandate, and that's the big lever, which we don't have control over, but we have input in, and we're obviously working cooperatively with our colleagues across the UK on. The bit that you're identifying in terms of what next will mean that the big issues and some of them we don't have control over. You can imagine in aviation and shipping, that's a challenging area, but in terms of there's limits to what we can do, but there's certain things we can do. HGV is 15% of some of our transport emissions. And that's an area that we are determined to do additional work on, which is why we've already this year done a number of things. Previously we've had the publication, I think there's been 2 iterations of it, the work with Heriot Watt in terms of HGVs, in terms of where they would be, in terms of charging points, where they might be. They've identified the need for 63. We've got 27 sites just currently. That gives an indication to the electricity networks and indeed the fleets as to how they might be able to plan in the future where they go. There needs to be a financing of that, and I think that's a big challenge. How do you know? Because obviously HGV fleets are very expensive, as we know. Most of our HGV fleets are SMEs as well. So that's why we've got this HGV readiness fund this year. And that's why we're working with consortium to identify potential funding routes. And secondly, and it's open just now for SMEs to help those that have got fewer than 50 in terms of their fleet.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I mean, I'm sure a lot of the detail of that will be in the climate change plan. But my concern here is that the government as a whole has made decisions to not accept CCC advice in areas of livestock reduction and a number of other areas as well. And the Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero has said that transport sector will be picking up the slack. So the megaton of emissions, which is currently missing in the CCP plans, will be picked up, we understand, ostensibly by transport. So I'm trying to understand where, if demand management is not being rolled out quickly enough, where that missing gap will be filled with transport. Is that something that we will see in the climate change plan? We will see transport step in to back up the policies that and the decisions the government have made to not take action deliberately in some areas, because transport's going to pick up the slack?
So the answer is yes, and I have given an answer. In terms of car use, the issues there, if you're going back to that previous point, your point about demand management, if there's a shift and a significant shift, which is what the Climate Change Committee are telling us, a significant shift higher than MD expected from petrol cars to EV cars, then the issues around what demand management will contribute will change as well. So I'm not saying that demand management can't be part of the mix. Incentives as well as, and obviously there's been some incentives have come from the UK government as well. We've got our low, we're particularly looking at second-hand purchase and for people on lower incomes, how they can purchase EVs. So there's the incentive side, and then there's the demand management side, again, led by local authorities, but it's got to be in the context that if they're saying to us that we're anticipating that it's less of a reduction in use that's required to reduce emissions because they're going to be EVs. In fact, there might be an increase in number of cars. Therefore, it's a different context. So I'm not disputing that's one part of the mix, but don't underestimate, in order to go further, we're going to have to start tackling some of the more challenging areas. And as I said, HGVs is one of the most challenging areas. And we know there's a journey to go on, but we've already started in this year's budget to try and get things moving.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm sure we'll see the plan at some point.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. Cabinet Secretary, just want to talk very briefly before I move on to the next subject on active and sustainable travel. Not last year, 23-24, there was a 50% underspend on where it is. We've got, I think, in 24-25 about £200 million in the budget. I get confused what is spent between the two, what's active and what's sustainable. So just so I understand, what are you going to spend on active travel of that £200 million, or has it all gone into the various announcements you've made for sustainable travel?
Sorry, I couldn't. Do you say ferries?
No.
No, sorry.
Sorry. It's usually me that struggles to hear Cabinet Secretary.
So
what I said was there was £200 million put in the budget for this year for active and sustainable travel. I get confused what's spent between how it's defined what's active and what's sustainable.
Right.
So what I want to know is what the split is this year of that £200 million between active and sustainable, and has the sustainable announcements that you've made to do with EVs, HEV funds and the rest of it taken the majority of that money, or will there be, how much is going to be spent on active travel? That's my question.
Right, so the EV charging is not part of that funding, that's separate, and that's separately annotated. In terms of the reason why it's active and sustainable is that we found, and this is what, again, feedback from local authorities, that when they are planning their routes, as many are doing in terms of their design, and indeed those that I'm sure Mr Doris will recognise in Glasgow, there's an awful lot of them in construction, that not only do we have to combine the cycling routes, but there's also what do we do with the bus routes as well. And the smart thing to do is to be able to combine any works on roads, not least for minimising disruption, is to look at what's needed for bus infrastructure as well as for active travel, as in the traditional walking, wheeling and cycling. So, and officials, if they can correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't have the figures exact to hand, but 168 million roughly in terms of the proposed spend. We are consistent with our budgeted spend for last year. Now, I recognise that not all of that was spent. We had a very challenging year. You remember there was an in-year budget by the new and incoming UK government, which had consequences, which made it a very challenging budget, and not everything could be spent that year. I am very pleased to say, in terms of the spend for active travel, that the proportions that are out, we've got the 25-26, we've got 37.5 million of Tier 1 funding for active travel been announced. And also in terms of the construction ready Tier 2, we've been able to announce that. And also in terms of, I suppose, all the active travel parts of that active travel budget, all of them have been announced to date, apart from some design work, and there's still some sort of design elements. So there is funding for bus infrastructure, which I know this committee was very interested in. That's about 20.
I'm sorry, I'm now getting more confused than I was at the beginning, Cabinet Secretary.
I'm just about to explain how we get to the total.
If we could, because Audit Scotland have said that conflagrating active travel and sustainable travel makes it really difficult to understand the figures. That's what they said in their report earlier this year. And when they asked Transport Scotland to say what was active and what was sustainable, apparently Transport Scotland scratched their heads as well. So if you could define and say of the 200 million, how much is actually going on active travel?
There'll be about 20 million for the infrastructure bus fund. I'll correct these figures if I'm trying to remember from my budget appearance earlier this year. There's about 20 million for we've got behaviour change of 27.9, we've got the bus infrastructure fund of 20 million, and then the remainder will be the active travel as similar levels as they were in previous years for what people would traditionally have seen as that aspect. Somewhere in there is also going to be the community bus fund, which I know is also very popular. It's a smaller amount in terms of funding. So in terms of the funding, it's in a good place. It's in a positive place. The reason it's combined is, as I've explained, in very practical terms, it's very helpful to local authorities to be able to use that funding in a sensible and coordinated way.
Okay, so perhaps you could put it in a letter, because I'm now even more confused. My maths is not good enough to tell me how exactly that £200 million. Perhaps we could have a chart. One says active, one says sustainable, and we can see the split of the 200 million. It's quite a big sum. Audit Scotland struggled, and I'm struggling as well. So if we can move on to the next subject, which is a subject very close to my heart, and I'll try not to make it too parochial, the A9 and the dualling of the A9. And I will acknowledge, Cabinet Secretary, that I'm grateful for the briefs that you've given MSPs on this. But can you just explain to me where we're at with the mutual investment model? Because I think we're due an update on decision-making that in the latter part of this year. So.
Yeah, so that's still the plan. Obviously, we have to look at how we can fund the A9, and the proposal was for some of those sections to be considered by a mutual investment model, which would be a case of using revenue with a private, privately funded model, similar to what the the Welsh Labour government have done for some, particularly on a road exercise. That means we have to work very closely, not just with Transport Scotland colleagues, but also with Finance and Exchequer. Those discussions are ongoing. Obviously, we'll be in a place to set out what we'll do. In fact, I met with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance on the MIM proposals in this very room, actually, just a few weeks ago. So that I can't tell you where we are with that in terms of the final decision. That will be something that I'll need to take to Cabinet as well. And obviously we'll make sure that not just this committee, but obviously MSPs generally more, make sure that they're aware of what that decision will be in terms of that MIM aspect of the funding.
Okay, so, I mean, we're probably somewhere north, and I can't remember the exact figures. I think the figures we were given was that it was something like 3.7 billion at 2023 prices to dual the A9. Yeah. So, if MIM doesn't work, I don't like that expression, mutual investment, things don't work, what happens then? Mutual investment models don't work. Where's that money going to come from? Do you have a plan for that?
So, I mean, obviously that then puts pressure on the capital budget, and obviously that's what we'd always said, that we need to revert to capital in that case. So that's why we're looking very, very closely at obviously the issues around the business plan for that, both in value for money in terms of what delivers in terms of the public purse, but also what is affordable in terms of the Scottish Government's budget. And that's exactly the discussions that we're having in relation to the A9, and that was always going to be the case in terms of what we'd set out in terms of those considerations.
But it won't diminish your determination to dual the A9?
Pardon?
It won't diminish if MEM fails?
No, I mean, and as I said, I mean, in terms of where we are, we're moving out onto procurement on Section 5. Section 4, as I said, has been awarded. Anybody, as you'll regularly do, will see the work that's happening just now, and you'll probably start seeing the groundworks on the Tay Crossing Ballanoog section as well.
I do, and I see the Spey Bridge, which is being resurfaced again in less than 8 years since it was resurfaced before, which adds to the confusion about roadworks. But just to link in, if I may, to the last subject on active travel, the missing bit on the A9 for active travel is the bit between Aviemore and Carr Bridge, which will be one of the areas that will be dualled. If we're underspending on the active travel budget, should we not be getting that bicycle lane sorted and the pedestrian walkway sorted before the roadworks start, which will make it even worse? Surely that's a good investment, Cabinet Secretary.
We're not underspending our active travel this year. I would let you, as I've set out, we are spending that full amount. There's only one tiny element that's not been set out for this year. And on that project, the steps that are needed to take place to make sure that happens I've had submissions of that in recent months to progress that, because obviously that's a keen and anticipated active travel route and is one of the benefits of that work on the A9. So again, that might be something I'm happy to provide a briefing in writing to the committee on that active travel segment of it.
I think from MSPs from the Highlands and Islands, it would be very interesting to hear that. So it would be useful to have that, just purely because it's the bit that is going to be critical to make sure that bicyclists and walkers are safe, especially during when the roadworks are. Michael, I think you want to come in on that point.
Thanks. Good morning. I want to just pick up on the A9 and actually any real major transport infrastructure project. I think we all recognise that good, effective transport infrastructure is critical to our economy. However, I'm interested in how we use major infrastructure projects like the A9 to drive wider economic growth. So, not so much that the infrastructure in itself provides, but if we are investing something in the region of what the figures we have are in the region of £3.7 billion at April 23 prices for the dualling of the A9. How do we make sure through the procurement process that we see as much of that investment going into supporting economic growth here in Scotland through the way in which it is dispersed and the way in which we procure the process within, whether it be in the Highland region or across the country as a whole. How do we go about doing that?
So one of the aspects that I'm very keen that we ensure is well understood is that transport is not just a functional delivery of services or indeed roads, etc., but actually in terms of that economic impact, it's huge. Not least the number that are employed in terms of, we think there's about 150,000 full-time equivalent jobs involved in transport generally, and obviously £10 billion in terms of gross value added. That's all set out in the value of transport report that we produced. But when you talk specifically about the A9, we take the Tomatin Tomoy section. Part of that was to ensure that there was economic impact in terms of local companies that have been employed and also local people that have employed, and opportunities for perhaps those that might not get employment elsewhere to be part of that. So that's a key requirement in terms of what has happened in terms of the A9 procurement to date, and certainly that's evidenced as I've seen and heard when I visited the site at Tomatin Tomoy in terms of that local provision of labour and local provision by local companies as well. And in terms of the challenges that we do have in Scotland, and I think this is a general one, I know you've taken interest in energy recently in some of your inquiries. The demand for construction in Scotland is very strong because obviously we're seeing that in the energy sector as well as on the road sector, and ensuring we get one value for money, but we also have to anticipate construction inflation, which we know has been in excess of others. Other areas, it does put pressure there. But I think the point about the supply chain is really, really important. And in terms of that supply chain in the road construction areas, that is something that Transport Scotland have worked very hard on in terms of those procurement of the different sections.
Yeah, and just so how do we specify that in our procurement process then, or how does Transport Scotland specify that for major transport infrastructure in the procurement process to ensure that local businesses are maximising the potential benefit that comes from what is huge investment into transport infrastructure? And are we in a position where we can actually demonstrate that? So I'm familiar with some of it sort of idea, but is there a way in which Transport Scotland can document and demonstrate the benefit that's come from, say, for example, Tomatin Tomoy? Can they quantify the amount of contracts that, I think, is it Balfour Beatty have got that contract? Can they demonstrate how much Balfour Beatty are using through that procurement process to maximise the benefit in the local supply chain?
Right, so the 2014 procurement legislation that you'll be familiar with sets out the importance of community benefit and in terms of the equal value of 10%, and that's set out more clearly in terms of the provision that we have across public sector contracts that are within our direct responsibility. So that can be exhibited. I have seen figures. I don't have them to hand today on Tomatin Tomoy. I can share with you what that breakdown is and the type of community benefit that looks like, of which that also includes in terms of the local businesses and that are involved in the delivery of different services within that. So we can certainly do that in that area. And I think that's, we can demonstrate that also. I think there's Transport Scotland have also produced a document in relation to procurement, which I've got in my inbox, which I want to study at greater length. So it actually sets out what the Transport Scotland procurement work is. I don't know whether Fiona, you're familiar with that one, or we can send the link to the committee, and you can read that in terms of that impact.
That'd be helpful. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Michael. And Douglas Lumsden, I think you're up next.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Still on Julian, but a different road cabinet secretary. The A96, obviously we had the corridor review published almost 4 months ago now. So what's the next steps that the government will be bringing forward on the A96 Julian project?
So as I said I would do, I published the consultation on that very quickly because I know that was a request from the meeting I had, the round table meeting I had with MSPs. In terms of the next steps, obviously we have to look at the A96 as a whole, and you know there's different sections of it. There's obviously the Inches to Smithton a section, there's the Inverness to Nairn, including Nairn Bypass, where we have taken title to land in April, and then there's the rest of the corridor, and obviously we've got the feedback from that. In terms of the prioritisation, that's one of the things that we're looking at from following the consultation. Clearly the consultation wanted full drilling of all of the A96. I think anybody that has an understanding of the current financial situation is that's not something that's immediate, but in terms of where we'll set out our plans, we'll have to have some forward look as to what the priorities would be. Clearly the feedback also said that an Elgin bypass was a priority, and I know that's something that clearly the Chambers of Commerce and others, going back to that point about the impact of transport on the economy, in terms of what will make most sense in terms of prioritisation, we'll consider that. In terms of the funding of it, it was always my view that we would need to identify in the forward look of the infrastructure investment plan as to what that would set out as a forward look. In terms of the timings of publication of these things, as the committee will know, in terms of both the capital forward look, spending review, the infrastructure investment plan, that's going to be obviously affected by timing of the budget. And I'm sure the committee is aware that as a result of the UK budget being later than we thought, that our budget will, as the Scottish Government budget, will be later, and that will have an impact on these other aspects. So I had thought we would be in a better position to identify when the infrastructure investment plan will be published. It's not my gift to say when that will be, but clearly the A96 is something that I know people will be looking at.
I guess it was 2011 that the Scottish Government first committed to dualling the A96 in full. So is that still a commitment by the Scottish Government? And should we expect then to see in the budget this year money assigned for the A96 work to start in the coming year?
So there was funding in this year's budget for obviously some of the sections of the A96. Obviously, I can't tell you what's going to be in next year's budget because that's still obviously subject to discussion for our one-year budget. In terms of the timescales of it, you know that I was quite clear to the committee, I was being straight with the committee that previous commitments in terms of time for delivery on full dualling would not be met. I think people expect us to be straight with them, and that's what I did previously, and I think I did it in this committee and made sure it was clear then. So I know you'll want to have information. A lot of these things have to be collectively agreed with Cabinet colleagues, and obviously the budget is an ongoing process, as you'll be aware just now, and I'm not at Cabinet today, but obviously there's lots of discussions taking place on budgets on a Tuesday morning, so committee, if you'd like me to be part of those discussions, please don't call me in for the next wee while.
So just Cabinet Secretary, if you want to be straight with people, is there still a commitment from the Scottish Government to fully dual the A96? I guess that's what people want to hear.
That is our current position. We will need to prioritise, and the ordering of that, there's quite a clear order because parts of the A96 are further along the process than others, and indeed one has gone a full public inquiry, and as I said, we've actually taken title to land in relation to some of that as well. In terms of the ordering, we have made sure that there was, as part of our market review on the capacity or interest in MIM, we included parts of the A96 in relation to those discussions when we were looking at the A9. Obviously, in relation to the A96, there's a challenge as to whether we just do a whole bundle of one project, or whether it would be more sensible in value for money and delivery to put it into smaller sections. I know there's a real appetite to have a focus particularly on the Nairn bypass. It's possible that can be done as a single project to get the ball rolling, for example, but I'm not in a position to give you the detail as to what will happen when in terms of that planning, but just to say there's ongoing work in terms of assessing what that project might look like.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Mark, you've got some supplementaries.
I mean, obviously, a lot of money was spent on a climate compatibility assessment, looking at the full dualling of the A96. Will that be reflected in the climate change plan in some way?
I'm not sure that the climate change plan will go into the detail of that assessment. The climate change plan will be about what the plans are to reduce emissions specifically. So therefore, the details of a road-by-road analysis would not be there. I don't anticipate, for example, the A9 to be a specific feature of the climate change plan.
Right, so are you saying that the A96 climate compatibility assessment suggests there's no impact on climate at all? The options within that. I'm not suggesting every single street should be in the climate change plan,
yeah,
but surely the two biggest multi-billion-pound road building programmes should be reflected in some way or another. Do they make emissions go up? Do they make emissions go down? Does it matter if everyone's driving EVs? I mean, I don't, being simplistic here, but how does it all add up?
So, I mean, I think your latter point is that I don't underestimate the significance of the Climate Change Committee's recommendations and advice, and it'll be interesting to see in terms of the UK government what their plans are when it comes out. They come out shortly, but the shift from petrol to EV, it might not be, you know, if everybody's driving an EV car rather than a petrol car, that has a different impact on emissions. So we can't deal with the hypotheticals of a plan for the A96 that currently doesn't exist. It can exist in part because we're further on in terms of the development of some parts of the A96, but you don't have conjecture. I don't want to have conjecture on a road that we haven't made decisions about. But
millions of pounds were spent on a climate compatibility assessment to help guide the government towards a balanced set of options for the road and for improvements. So what was the conclusion of that, and will that be reflected in the climate change plan?
I think your expectations of the climate change plan are different from what the climate change plan needs to be. I'm not in charge of the climate change plan.
Right.
That's
I mean, it needs to add up simply.
Yeah, it needs to, of course it needs to add up, but it can add up. The whole point about it can add up in different ways. An increasing use of EV cars as opposed to petrol cars is a significant development that the Climate Change Committee, the UK Climate Change Committee, is stating, and that will be reflected in the Climate Change Plan.
Okay.
Thanks for that. Michael, I think you've got some questions now you want to ask.
So I want to turn to the issue of rail, particularly given we've got Mr Reeves here today on ScotRail and Network Rail performance. I was struck by the recent figures that ScotRail had the lowest train cancellation rates in the UK in 2024-25, with an average of only 2% of stops being cancelled compared to a UK average of 3.3%. Do we know why ScotRail's performance has improved in this area, and why it's the lowest in the UK when it comes to cancellations?
So I think the specific focus that ScotRail has on delivery for customers, I think in terms of the focus that we have had under public ownership, all these things have led to a good and improving performance. I would also reflect that the fact that we've had a regular timetable this year will help also in terms of this year's figures, and that's really important. That's also testament to what I think is reflected by the rail unions as a good and constructive relationship with the Scottish Government, and that has been enhanced by public ownership, and obviously I recognise the members' previous role in that decision in terms of where we are. So therefore all these items have helped in terms of performance. I would also say in terms of the public understanding and perception of ScotRail, that it is the highest of the largest rail providers, 91%. I think that's obviously a good reflection in terms of the public performance. Where I think there are still challenges, I'm not saying everything is all in a good place. I think we still need to deliver on what we are investing in the system, and that some of that will be in relation to our investment with Network Rail in terms of our strategy and priorities in terms of them, and they're still not meeting the targets I would like to see in terms of performance. So yes, it's good, and it's certainly comparatively good with the rest of the UK. I think public ownership certainly has added to that. I think it's very striking that the UK government is seeking to replicate what we have here in Scotland in terms of their plans on rail reform, and I would emphasise to this committee this is a really important piece of work that we'll have to consider in Scotland in terms of where the UK-wide legislation will have an impact on Scotland, and it's an area that I'm spending a great deal of time. In fact, Bill Reeves, you referred to, is actually Director of Rail Reform dedicated to this particular area, and obviously I'll try and convener to keep the committee as appraised as I can as to when you might expect to have information, so that will have an impact as well. So that's a segue into rail reform, which I just want to highlight to the committee. We cannot see a diminution of the powers that we currently have in Scotland. I'm working very hard, as our colleagues, I'm working constructively with DFT to ensure that, but it's really important that we protect the powers that we have, because a lot of our successes in rail has been through agreement, through the alliance, in bringing together planning for activity and work, for example, ensuring that Network Rail work with ScotRail when they're planning different works, etc., that can avoid issues and cancellations. But as you've seen with Storm Amy, where we've seen in different circumstances, particularly on the network, that can cause issues around cancellations. Other issues, cancellations, sadly, unfortunately, we have fatalities, which obviously can cause disruptions as well. So there is a kind of complex picture in relation to cancellations. But by and large, I'm very pleased with the performance of ScotRail.
Okay, just on the point you made there about GB Rail, is there a concern that it could reduce the level of responsibility and the role of Scottish ministers in operation of the rail network here in Scotland?
So I will bring in Bill Reeves to expand on some of this because he will have had great more contact with our officials, working with DFT officials. I've met several times and in person with Lord Hendy, the Rail Minister, to impress on him that there can't be a situation where there's any reduction in the powers that we have. Clearly, the way that GB Rail, remember the rail reform was, the concept of it was initially established by the UK government, the Conservative UK government, and then picked up by the incoming Labour government. And in terms of my requirement, I think what's key is we need to ensure that the GB Rail is accountable and responsible to Scottish ministers for that which we have, where we have strategic and financial responsibilities. So we fund Network Rail currently to over £1 billion a year. We set out our strategic requirements of that. It's only right and proper that we should have that direct control over that section of the work. How that is then set out in legislation is going to be a key issue. We expect legislation fairly soon. We have yet to be assured that it will ensure that we have the devolved executive devolution that we currently have will be maintained, and that's something that I'm spending a great deal of time on. But is it okay, Convener, if I can bring in Bill Reeves to expand on this point? Bill.
Good morning, Convener. Good morning, Mr Matheson.
Morning.
Gosh, well, if I just go back, and it's directly relevant to the cancellation figures, I'm pleased to say, and I checked this morning, the latest figures are now 1.6% in Scotland, which is almost exactly half that of the rest of GB. The reason I mention that is those distinctly and consistently better performance figures we get in Scotland, by just about any measure, reflect the way in which, under devolved arrangements, we have worked really hard to ensure the joining up of the infrastructure under Network Rail, still owned by the UK government, and ScotRail, now fully owned by the Scottish government, in an integrated, coherent system. And that work that we have done to try and limit the damage of the disintegrated railway under the current legislation has been noticed, and if I talk to the UK Rail Minister and indeed his officials, what we have done in Scotland is is a big influence on their proposals for the reform of railways across GB under the current legislation, which is quite gratifying. We are assured that current devolved arrangements will be respected and in no way diminished. There is, however, a continued difficulty that the ownership of the infrastructure is proposed to remain under the UK government, whereas the train operations will remain under the ownership of the Scottish Government. So you'll see that creates a structural barrier to the integration, as distinct from what we might absolutely prefer. We are therefore working extremely hard with our colleagues in the Department for Transport to ensure that we mitigate that odd separation of ownership from funding and strategic responsibility. And we're looking at arrangements that we believe will secure not just no worsenment, but actually some improvement in the level of our control over that very substantial amount of funding we provide to Network Rail. I don't know of any other area of the Scottish Government where we have devolved responsibility for the strategy, the specification and the funding, but don't actually have ownership of the asset that we're providing all that funding for. So that's been a big area of focus for us in our discussions. The discussions are constructive. We are cautiously optimistic that we'll get a good result. We have not yet seen the final version of the bill, however, and alongside the bill there will also need to be intergovernment agreements, because there's a lot more that's changing than the bill will absolutely specify. And as you might imagine, that's a focus of our efforts at the moment, as the UK government is proposing to submit that bill to the UK Parliament before the end of this calendar year.
Okay, that's helpful. Well, I think it will be useful for the committee to be kept up to date on where progress has been made or not, and potential risks and issues that may arise from that, just given that it's a live issue. Can I turn then though to the issue of performance and PPM and where we are? So the annualised figure is what, 92.5%, has been for quite an extended period of time now. From what I can see, as yet, ScotRail's still not been able to achieve that. It's sitting at just under 90%, from what I can see in the latest. I think that's annualised figure rather than a periodic figure. Periodic figure, I think, is slightly better for the last 4 weeks. However, we haven't actually saw what I would say is a significant improvement on PPM performance. If I go back to where we were in 2008, 2009, 10, we're broadly in line with where PPM was then, and that was still below the target. What are the principal inhibitors to seeing us achieve that annualised 92.5% PPM figure?
I will bring in Bill as well on this one. And Convener, just kind of before we finally leave rail reform, we do anticipate there may be a need for an LCM, and obviously this committee would have a role in relation to that, in relation to rail reform. So I'm just flagging with you that that's out with our control in terms of timing, but obviously I know how busy this committee is, so I'm just putting that there as we will keep you as informed as we can on that. You're right, and in fact that's why I said in my response to you in opening remarks is however good some of the performance figures are, I'm not satisfied that we're meeting completely what is required and expected, which is why I have regular meetings with both ScotRail and Network Rail chief executives together to drive and identify what improvements can be made. Obviously, there has been a level of disruption in relation to that COVID period compared to the figures that you're talking about in 2008-10, but we would want to see that improvement drive. So this has got to be about consistent improvement in terms of their activity and in terms of the performance. There are things that can, in terms of the areas that there are a whole variety of different things that affects performance. but it's not where I want it to be, and it's not where we're specified that it needs to be, and therefore that's why, in terms of our accountability, we're trying to make sure that in terms of that public ownership in particular as well, that we're driving that forward. It is the People's Railway, and people expect it to not just provide a service, but to have a continuing improving service, and that's what I'm trying to focus on just now as well. But if we can ask Bill Reeves to come in, convener, would that be okay? Sure. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Okay. So I think the specific question was what are the key causes that limit performance or restrict performance? Clearly, there are some things like very severe weather, and sadly, things like fatalities on the railway, which have an impact. There is work done, of course, to mitigate the impact of both of those. Again, to put this in perspective, ScotRail's averaging a little bit below 91% ppm at the minute. And by the way, that's an assessment of ScotRail and the infrastructure, the importance of those two working together. We have a single measure for the whole system, and both bits of the system have the same target, and that compares with a comparable figure of around 86% in Britain, the rest of Britain. The principal causes include reliability of rolling stock, and you'll be aware there have been recent announcements about procurement of new fleets, both for the intercity and a significant portion of the suburban fleet, which will help. But in the meantime, of course, there's a continued focus on improving the maintenance effectiveness of the current operation. There's train crew availability has been another significant cause, compounded by some industrial relations issues in previous years, but again, the improvement in industrial relations issue is seeing a reduction in that, combined, of course, with the largest driver recruitment programme that I've ever known ScotRail to have, and I think it tops the league in GB as well at the moment. So that, again, is seeing improvements. There are, of course, also infrastructure failures from time to time. Again, the network rail infrastructure performs better in Scotland than elsewhere, but our colleagues in Network Rail are working hard under that 4.2 billion operation, maintenance and renewal funding that we've got for control period 7, the regulatory control period, to focus their expenditure on areas that will improve performance. And again, distinctly from the rest of Britain, we included within that 5-year funding settlement a 50 million performance improvement fund over and above the funding of regular operation, maintenance and renewal, precisely to allow funds to be targeted on those aspects of the system which would deliver the biggest improvement in performance. We have always set a stretching target for ScotRail and Network Rail, and I do believe we wouldn't be as good as we were if we hadn't set that stretching target. We do beat that target in some periods. We don't beat it consistently, such the MAA is, moving annual average, apologies for that acronym, is where we wish it to be. And that's perhaps the last thing I should have mentioned, is that there is always a very discernible dip each year during autumn, which is associated with issues of poor adhesion, an inevitable feature that affects railways around the globe, I have to say, which causes a number of issues with performance of trains, not least the need to brake, to allow for more cautious braking techniques. Which brings us back to our investments, where the train specifications include a requirement for improved braking systems to cope with low adhesion. So we understand with our colleagues in Scotland's Railway the causes. We are focusing our funding to address those.
You're slightly pushing my definition of short. It's certainly pushing my definition of short.
I do apologise.
Fulsome,
sorry,
perhaps.
Go back
to the Deputy Convener.
Okay, thanks. I want to turn. That's helpful, and I understand and appreciate some of these challenges. And I think ScotRail expect to achieve PPM by 2027-2028 as part of their 5-year improvement programme, which I wish them well with. On the issue of decarbonisation of our railways, so Cabinet Secretary recently announced the partial electrification of the Borders railway line and also, I think, the Leavenmouth line with the intention of using battery electric trains, I understand. Can you give us a bit more detail about what your plans are there for both of these particular lines? And also, in decarbonising our railways, it's clearly not going to be achieved through full electrification, in my view. There is going to have to be other options pursued in order to decarbonise some of our lines, particularly if you look at sort of lines going up to Inverness and some other parts of the rural Scotland, where electrification, I think, actually would end up creating resilience challenges, particularly during adverse weather in the winter months. What are the other options we're looking at to decarbonise our railways if we can't achieve it through electrification?
So there's a lot in there. Can I say it's actually the Fife line as a...
The Fife, sorry.
As a whole. The Levermouth was built capable of taking electric when it was originally opened, and obviously the Borders, and we've just had a very pleasant celebration of the 10th anniversary of the Borders Railway, and obviously in terms of the electrification there, it will be electrification but using battery electric trains, which also will have what will be like, very sort of welcome, level boarding and different other aspects for customers that will be very welcome as well. In terms of the decarbonisation plans for Scotland, we will, again, that's an area that obviously has influence on the climate change plan that we'll be producing as well, and so therefore the timing of producing that. I know this committee has been interested for some time about where that refresh is, but I'm sure you appreciate it makes sense to incorporate what our plans are for Fife and Borders in particular in that. Your second part of the question is, are we actively looking at other alternatives? And I think the obvious one would be on hydrogen. I know you've taken an interest as a member and as a minister previously in hydrogen chains. There isn't any immediate work being taken place by the Scottish Government on provision of hydrogen. I think your analysis, however, is correct in that at some point in the future you could certainly see where the hydrogen in parts of the country is being produced, would have access then to use of that hydrogen for rail, but that would involve considerable amount of investment on fleet, etc. And in terms of that work, I know because I actually visited the prototype of hydrogen chain during COP26, that obviously there are certain interests in helping develop that, but I don't want to give you the impression that that's something that I, with my limited budget currently, however big it might be compared to others, can be able to focus time and attention on at this point in time. But I think your perspective is one that we should leave ourselves open to.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I don't think we can wait for hydrogen. I still think we have to press on with decarbonisation. It's looking at other options beyond electrification that can help to decarbonise our railways. Well, because I suspect the hydrogen trains are quite a long distance away for us, and also I think also in some of the high-speed routes, hydrogen just wouldn't be effective because you burn through so much of it. It wouldn't be operational. So I just think, what other options are we looking at? Well,
so there are alternative fuels, and you may have seen the news recently, I think just this week, that ScotRail have looked at alternative fuels to diesel that would be less emissions. That's something that I think across different modes people are looking at. And there are other sustainable fuels that can be used. I don't have the detail of information on that, but it's something that I'm sure we could find, get a briefing from ScotRail as to what they were trialling, because they've done that just in the last week.
Okay, that'd be helpful, thanks.
There's a number of supplementaries, and I'm going to go to Douglas Lumsden in a minute. Cabinet Secretary, you tried to, and I appreciate, offer some help as far as an additional LCM. It'd be wrong as convener if I didn't ask you when we can expect to receive that. You offered, I'm asking.
Yeah, we don't know because we're not in charge of the UK
Roughly.
legislation. So, well, we're anticipating, and I think we're anticipating the UK legislation before the end of this calendar year, but I can't tell you when that might be. And it's a complex piece of legislation. Obviously, as soon as that is published, we'd want to move quite quickly to let you know what the timetable is. All I'm doing is I want to put it on your radar because it's a very serious piece of work.
I think we had it on our radar along with all the other things that we're doing in the new year, of which are too many to mention. Douglas and then Kevin Stewart.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Just seeking clarification on the cancellation statistics, Cabinet Secretary. Does that statistics also take into account services that have been cancelled due to a temporary timetable being introduced? Obviously, for 3 months last year, I think we had about 700 services per day axed because we're on a temporary timetable. So did that statistics feed into the cancellation statistics?
So I think if you heard what Mr. Reeve said, that the 1.6 is for this year, and we've been because we've not been on a subject to temporary timetables this year compared to last year. I think we're in a better position. There were obviously temporary timetables previously. Temporary timetables were when there was a period where we were obviously discussing with drivers pay issues, as you might understand last year. But that we're not in that position this year, which is probably why, unless Bill's about to correct me, that we're now seeing and actually even improved level. It doesn't mean that there aren't temporary timetables from time to time, but that's been less evident this year. And I think, therefore, the figure of 1.6 is very helpful indeed. The cancellation is measured against the temporary timetable as well, which also then, that point about the premise of your question would mean that the cancellations, you'll recognise that. But as I said, there have been fewer temporary timetables needed to be operating this year. And actually, that's why you're seeing an even improved position than it is compared to the 2.2% that you had in the previous year.
Yeah, but I guess, so from that answer then, the 700 last year, 700 services cancelled per day for 3 months, that doesn't feed into the cancellation statistics then, just to confirm.
Bill, do you want to explain further?
That's absolutely correct, Mr. Lumsden. And the view is taken that where it's known that it will not be possible to run the normal set of services for whatever reason, passengers value the certainty of a temporary timetable rather than the uncertainty of turning up and not knowing which trains will run. And the cancellations for that period are measured against the advertised temporary timetable. That's the case in the rest of GB as well, where extensive use of that has been made on occasions. I'm sorry, I would incur the convener's wrath if I go into the detail of that at great length, but you're quite correct in what you've said, Mr. Lumsden.
Okay, thank you. I think it's a good point to clarify. Thank you.
Thanks. Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. I left Aberdeen today at 5:57 on an HST. Got in almost in time at Waverley. I understand that HST procurement is underway. I won't ask about that. I know that there are reliability issues around about HST, so sooner the better. But in terms of other reliability issues, there are often delays on the lines that I use because of specific infrastructure failures. Some of them happen quite often, including signalling around about Montrose. Do we monitor these to the degree that we should, and does Network Rail react in terms of its improvement programmes to replace what are often seen by commuters as being consistent failures?
So I think you're correct to identify that there are different elements for reliability. And I mean, there's currently signalling issues that are affecting what was certainly yesterday on the Inverness line in particular. Obviously, the rapidity and speed at which they're repaired is really important, but I think your point is more about the planned improvements. Yeah. And that is why we put a great deal of emphasis, again, on our, we provide the funding, we provide the strategy and the specification to Network Rail, but we don't micromanage the delivery because their responsibilities are still tied in relation to the ownership by the UK government and their internal management on that. So in terms of the areas that certainly some of the improvements in the North East line, we're looking at particularly the Dundee-Arbroath area. I know that there's planned work to trying to coordinate those planned improvements at the same time. But Bill, in terms of that kind of, I mean, I'm assuming that you're better to ask Network Rail how they manage that kind of, if there's a regular occurrence of areas that have delays because of signalling or other failures, how they approach the management of their work. But that would be the sensible thing to do, and I'm sure that they would look at it. But I can obviously hear you. We can obviously relate to Network Rail your interest around the Montrose area in particular. But I don't know if there's anything you can add to that or not.
The statistics for the Montrose area specifically, I'm afraid, Mr. Stewart, but I can confirm that ScotRail and Network Rail do analyse patterns of failure, and investments are targeted at areas with known weakness. I should just, with the convener's permission, have mentioned the other big source of delay is cross-border services. Sure. And the committee may wish to be aware of some concerns we have about the impact of the new LNER timetable from December, but that's perhaps a subject for a future arrangement. We're anticipating that as something which will have an adverse impact on ScotRail.
And I've already made representations to the UK Minister, who says he will review this, but if there's priority given to cross-border lines, it then has an impact on our ScotRail services. That will appear in the figures that obviously you've got concerns about delays. So I think that's a kind of, we should all be keeping our eye on that.
Is that you finished, Kevin? Yes, sorry. Thanks. Just before we leave this subject, I seem to have been looking at trains for as long as I've been looking at ferries in this Parliament and the last Parliament. I seem to remember 4 ministers coming in and justifying why Abellio should lose the contract on the fact that they didn't meet their PPM targets. That was the reason given to the committee, and the reasons that Bill Reeve has given this morning. The 6 reasons, I think, main reasons, were the same problems that Abellio faced that ScotRail are now facing. So we've got less trains running and we've got less performance than Abellio was achieving. Why is that good news for Scotland and Scotland's commuters, Cabinet Secretary?
So I think we've got more routes and we've got increasing number of passengers, and I think in terms of recovery we're likely then to see even more positive figures this year. So in terms of the performance, clearly I'm not saying everything is sugar-coated, which is why I was quite specific and we had that engagement with the Deputy Convener in relation to the PPM and our expectation. I would emphasise that point, that our PPM is a joint one in relation to ScotRail and Network Rail. So your question is particularly about one aspect of that, which is obviously the operator itself. And in terms of the decision-making, in terms of public ownership, you'll also be aware, because obviously this committee looked at the LCM at that point. I think a number of you, of the committee members of a certain party, were opposed to the changes that took place in terms of public ownership, that it would no longer be an issue of last resort, but it could be an active decision at such times as franchises come to an end. And that was obviously on a UK-wide basis, but we'd obviously taken that decision already ourselves.
Okay, I'm still confused. We've got less trains, but more passengers. So people are using fewer trains. So therefore it should be easier to, well, if there's less trains running and more passengers are getting on the fewer trains. So my question is, why is that not helping?
Well, I'll certainly look at the statistics in terms of number of actual trains. There's obviously an issue around length of trains. Many people know we're not least, I mean, we've just increased the passenger, the carriage lengths on the West Highland Way. We've extended carriages. So, there are lots of, I mean, I know my railway journey, there used to be 4 carriages. They've strengthened and lengthened the line. I mean, I can get into statistical...
Cabinet Secretary, I'm very delighted if you want to... The simple question then, start off with, are there less trains running now on the network in Scotland than there were when Abellio were running the line? Yes or no?
I can't remember the precise numbers. A small number fewer running today than before the pandemic period when Abellio was in charge.
So there are less trains running. That's a fact.
That is correct. Yeah.
They might be longer trains that are running at the moment. Therefore, more passengers can get on them. I understand that, but it should mean that the timings for those trains should have improved if there's less congestion on the line. Or have I got that completely wrong?
Well, congestion, as we've heard, can happen for lots of different reasons, and not least, for cross-border. There could be, freight. There can be other issues. So, I think these questions are probably best placed that you address with ScotRail directly. I think.
Okay, not sure that's taking me any further, but I mean, my premise is that with less trains running, we should have a greater accuracy on delivering trains within 5 minutes of their scheduled arrival time. But we don't seem to have that. And we're saying that we're not going to be in the position that Abellio was as far as the PPM until 2027. That seems poor.
I think that's an assertion of an opinion, I think, as opposed to... So that's,
sorry,
which you're entitled to have. Yeah.
Did you not... Well, of course, we're all entitled to our own opinion, Cabinet Secretary. My point is, though, you said that we won't be back, you won't reach your 5-year target till 2027, which is the close on PPM. You said on the rail improvement. So that figure that you're quoting for 2027 is the figure that Abellio more closely reached than ScotRail have reached at the moment. And you're saying that it's going to take another 2 years to get there. So is that good news? How can you package that as good news?
Well, I think public ownership has been good news. I know certain parties don't agree with that, and they're entitled to that opinion.
Okay. I think we'll have to agree to disagree.
Yeah.
Monica, I think you've got the next questions.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, I'd like to ask some more questions about bus and bus use. So I perhaps won't go into the detail that the conveners just tried to get into around some of the stats around trains, but by every measure that I have seen, we are seeing a substantial long-term decline in bus use, so whether it's patronage, mileage and the number of services that we have in Scotland. I know you might want to reflect on the pandemic experience and we're seeing a slight return on pre-pandemic levels, but I'm quite struck to read that bus use peaked around about 2007, 2008, but we are down about 1/3, about 31% since then. I just wonder why that is and what analysis the Scottish Government has been doing to look at that trend, because it looks like a substantial long-term decline.
Mm-hmm. So obviously the committee will know that the privatisation of the bus system took place in the 80s and into the 90s. The Scottish Government is in control of the bus system. There were no changes made during the 1990s by the then UK Labour government and into the 2000s. We took a decision collectively, the Scottish Parliament in 2019, to make changes to the bus regulatory provision by providing different options, bus partnerships, franchises, etc. And as the committee will know, because you've gone through all the legislation, that all the relevant statutory instruments have been put in place to allow more control, to allow local authorities then to, and indeed regional transport partnerships, if that is the case, to take more control over bus systems. I don't know whether Fiona can give us a kind of the analysis of the kind of the people's behaviour over that time, but it will certainly be in relation to the number of routes that are available. And I think what you're seeing is obviously those private companies that are operating the majority of the routes. There'll be some routes that are more profitable than other routes. And clearly in terms of the experience of the pandemic, it had a very severe effect on bus patronage, more so I think than other modes. But in terms of the return, I also quite aware that the introduction of free bus travel for under 22s, particularly coming out of the pandemic, was seen as a really helpful stabiliser to the income levels of bus companies that could otherwise have seen quite a kind of really even worse situation perhaps. I have reflected already in that a lot of the bus patronage for older people was significantly reduced coming out of the pandemic. We're starting, and the reason we know that is particularly from the concessionary travel use, we're starting to see that kind of certainly increasing and improving, which is a good thing. But in terms of the overall position, I suppose, over the last period, I've only been Cabinet Secretary for the last 2 years. I'm not quite sure what happened, from 2007-8 onwards, whether it's availability of more people increasing in use of cars or whatever. But in terms of that change in patronage, obviously it's something that we keep close eye on. So therefore, trying to find ways of encouraging people to use buses is really important. Reliability is really important, as well as affordability, and that's why the Bus Infrastructure Fund, which is part of the active and sustainable funding, is really important, because we know that when buses are reliable, there's greater obviously communication now with apps, etc., about when buses are likely to turn up, and that's really important. Also, some of the things that we're trying to do is obviously people are outside and waiting for buses, and the Bus Infrastructure Fund will be used by some local authorities for shelters, etc. And that's particularly important in more rural areas where obviously timings, etc. might be variable. So I don't know, Fiona, if there's I can ask Fiona Bryan if there's anything sort of analysis of what's happened over that extensive period, 20-year period.
I think you summarised, but just to summarise what the Cabinet Secretary said, and it is set out in the National Transport Strategy, I think the point that the decline of bus did predate the pandemic, but then the pandemic is exacerbated. So, of course, changes in people's travel behaviour, increasing dependence on car, change in shopping and commuting habits, so different changes in lifestyle. And then in the recent years since the pandemic, that you noted the contraction in services and the increased cost of services, and really other external pressures, inflationary pressures on the cost of running transport services and skill shortages. So, and it's both impacted commercial services and locally subsidised services or contracted services.
And just on that, for Fiona, or of course the Cabinet Secretary, we're seeing a decline in the number of bus services. We've talked in the committee before about bus deserts, parts of the country where there's no longer a bus that's accessible or easy for people to use the service. What is driving that reduction in the availability of the bus service? Is it because we're seeing a decline in patronage, or is patronage going down because there is no bus service? Like, what deep analysis has been done?
I think you just explained it. There's a vicious cycle quite often where, you know, reduced patronage leads to fewer services lead to reduced patronage, and I think that's what needs to be addressed in terms of what local authorities and regional transport partnerships can do with the powers they have to help improve that in a more strategic way. And there's obviously that kind of services are, the costs of it are kept lower. Obviously there's fuel costs, there's obviously bus driver issues, which I think are still there in some parts of the country, but are not as severe as they were maybe 2 years ago. That would have impacted bus driver availability, also impacted at different points on routes. So that's the bit that we have to break out of.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think I've got some questions that will hold. I think Mark Russell's going to come in a moment as well, because this is an important topic. But Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned the Bus Infrastructure Fund. Can you just explain whether that's a multi-year fund? What can we expect in future budget allocations? And whether you believe there's sufficiency to deliver a step change in on-street bus priority measures that will really help to deliver that modal shift?
Yes. So I think there can and there could be a real shift in terms of reliability because of the Bus Infrastructure Fund that can lead to bus priority lanes, etc. We've seen the success of that in terms of reliability and those that are there. Your request for multi-year funding is one that I would support and echo. However, as you know, in terms of currently we're in the discussions about multi-year funding in terms of our spending review. We've obviously got our budget, the one-year budget, and obviously there's an issue, there's a small detail of election coming up for obviously future planning for the incoming government. I'm keen particularly that we do, because I think the interruption we had, and the convener was right to identify that we couldn't follow through with all the funding we wanted to on the active and sustainable travel last year, and that means that I don't think we get as much value for money if you have a stop-start approach to these areas, because actually what local authorities want is a continual rolling programme, not least from their staffing and all the other aspects, but also on delivery. That's the same actually I would say for active travel routes, not just bus infrastructure as well. So I would like to see that. I think it's important as part of our climate change approach in the climate change plan, that there are key areas that if we want to see that shift and we want to see that greater use of public transport for lots of different reasons, not just emission reduction, but health, well-being and also vibrancy of communities, that we do need to make sure we could give some certainty, because I think that you'll get better delivery and you'll get better value for money from construction and design, etc. So I'd like to say yes, but that's a question probably to ask the Cabinet Secretary for Finance rather than myself.
No, that's helpful. I think you've given a really good response there. Do we have enough champions for bus across government? It's not all down to you, Cabinet Secretary, so do you feel that you're getting a bit of solidarity from colleagues?
Well, can I just say, I think every MSP will know that bus is one of the issues that comes into our inboxes as constituency MSPs on a regular basis. And so everybody as individuals can see that. In terms of champions for bus, I think anything that this committee can do to help encourage that across party and across our other MSP colleagues, that would be welcome, because I think in terms of the change that we have, the vast majority of public transport is by bus, and we just have to encourage more people to do that, and that means having more availability of bus routes that are meaningful for people in the modern day travel patterns. And I'm afraid for some parts of the country, the bus routes don't actually reflect what the modern needs are. And increasingly we see that they go east to west across the Central Belt, whereas quite often I know that we need to have more north-south routes within Lanarkshires, within the West Lothians, to help reflect people's patterns of need, both in leisure and also for work.
Okay, thank you.
Mark, I think you're going to come in, and then I think we're going to go back to Monica for some more questions, perhaps. Yeah, sure.
So I wanted to turn to, the franchising, the route to franchising, and obviously SPT are now, on that pathway. When we last looked at this as a committee, I think the Minister, Jim Fairley, had said that by the end of 2024 we would have sight of the statutory bus franchising guidance and also the memorandum of understanding on the bus franchising panel and the way that operates. Now, we've not had that, convener, I don't think, at all. And so I'd like to know when we can get that.
So again, as Minister Jim Fairley is leading on this area, the guidance is currently undergoing final engagement with key parties on the franchising process, which includes the Competition and Markets Authority and the Office of the Traffic Commissioner. Once that's completed, that guidance will be shared with this committee and others, including obviously the local transport authorities, etc. And the final timescales for publication will depend on the capacity of these stakeholders to consider and engage with the draft document, because it will be issued in draft. And we're currently, as you referred to, the Memorandum of Understanding with the UK Government about the cost of running the independent approval panels for the franchising process, and subject to negotiations being agreed with the UK Government, will provide the committee with a copy of the MOU for their awareness. So they're in those final stages, is what I've got in terms of my
Right. But I think that was a message we had a year ago. We're in the final stages. There needs to be consultation. So is it fair to say that this is a year behind now? And when would be a realistic timescale? December, January, February?
I think I'm very keen it is delivered, because we're now in a situation that it's absolutely needed. Obviously, as parallel processes were taking place, and obviously SPT, for example, who are obviously the authority and the lead on this, have only just come to their conclusion just now, then it absolutely is needed. Can I say that we were being told when I was sitting where you were sitting on the committee that the draft guidance would be there at that point? So I don't want to speculate how delayed it is from when it was originally promised, because I think it was extensive. It's not just a year, but there's obviously a lot of work involved. It's not just us. We've got to, obviously, these are key people that we have to consult with, particularly in relation to the Competition and Markets Authority. Why that is the case is I know from talking to colleagues in other parts of the UK that the threat of legal action, it was very real, in fact, and it was realised in some instances. So therefore getting this right and helping make sure that guidance helps avoid any such situation is going to be really important.
Okay, I mean, I would hope that sitting where you're sitting now, you would feel a little bit more empowered to, deliver some progress on this, than notwithstanding the challenges that you've already laid out. I mean, I think there is a huge frustration here, Cabinet Secretary, about how slow the process is taking in Scotland. And, we've heard already that I think the English government, UK government has announced £15.6 billion to put into public transport, and I think many of the metropolitan regions in England will be looking at franchising, municipalisation as a way to really, develop their services, their bus services that are in the public interest. I don't want to sort of, get into the kind of budget decisions that are yet to come, but presumably we would expect Barnett consequentials coming through as a result of that announcement of £15.6 billion in England. And would you see franchising and municipalisation as an important part of the kind of transformation in bus services that we're looking for.
So unfortunately,
for the next budget.
So unfortunately, the spending review that we received from the UK government wasn't as positive as you're making out. In fact, in terms of resource, it's negative, and for transport in particular, it's positive substantially on capital, but also the concern we have about the spending review from the UK government is the health capital consequentials are negligible. And so therefore, what we anticipate in terms of the UK government is they intend to finance their capital for health through resource funding. And obviously that has consequences as to how we then manage our budget in terms of where we put it. So I'm just trying to, dampen your expectation that this manage expectations is not, a huge amount of funding that people might be clear about. Obviously, franchising takes different stages. What's happening in the rest of the UK, they're behind where we are. We know from experience it can take a long time. I think in terms of Manchester, it was 6-7 years and also involved legal challenge as well. So obviously, part of what we're trying to do is to ensure that whatever comes can be as robust as possible to help support. It would be their proposals. It will be obviously from SBT and others. It will be their proposals, but it obviously needs to be as strong as possible. In terms of resourcing, that will be subject to what plans come forward. We've yet to see that from SBT, but would anticipate they obviously will need to finance this to a great deal of themselves, but they may have an ask of government, but I don't know what that is yet.
Okay. One policy that was agreed in the last budget, at a very simple price of £2 million, was a bus fare cap, a regional bus fare cap. Yeah. Now, I think the date that was given that was going to be operational was the 1st of January next year. So we've got 3 months to go. My understanding is that I don't think there's been a discussion yet with the sector about introducing that, and I don't think there's been discussions with individual regions who have indicated that they would be interested in running that bus fare cap about actually rolling it out for 1st of January. So, given that, are we still on track for that? Is that going to happen?
I think it would be wrong to say there's no discussions. There has been engagement, but right. In terms of the proposals, that we're still going to be. Our intention is to deliver that. So, happy for my colleague Jim Fairley to give you an update as to where that is. But
so we're fairly confident there'll be a bus fare cap in one region of Scotland. Operational 1st of January.
But as you said, that there's quite clearly we've got to engage not only with the local regional transport partnership, but also with the bus sector themselves, the private companies that operate our bus companies, our bus services. So that's the engagement that has to take place to deliver on that. But that was a commitment made, and so that's our intention is to deliver that.
Okay. We're down to a few weeks, aren't we? That are left, to be honest, before that date. But there we go. Okay. I hope it does get delivered.
Okay. Right. There's a few other people who want to question you on buses, Cabinet Secretary. We'll go to Monica, followed by Bob.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, it's a pity we don't have much more time on this. I know there's been an issue at the Public Petitions Committee. Mark Ruskell's outlined, I think, the frustrations that campaigners and others have around the delay, not just in this committee, but the country seeing this statutory guidance, which we've been led to believe is really important. So I think there's a commitment that we'll see guidance soon. I'm not quite sure what you were saying, Captain, about the funding, because we have had it narrated in the Chamber and elsewhere in Parliament about the substantial investment that the UK Government has made available to some of the regions in England. So it's not really clear to me what you've said about how the Barnett consequentials would be used. But we do know that there's huge public support for franchising. SPT have published their ambitious plans. There is a concern that some of these delays are stopping other regional transport partnerships from going ahead with their proposals. And we understand that some of this sits with your ministerial colleague, Jim Fairley, but it feels like there is a lack of leadership on this. What can you say today to really reassure people who want to be using bus services, who want to have more certainty, those communities that feel underserved right now? Because what I'm seeing in my mailbox and on the street and in Parliament is people coming to lobby, to protest, campaigners, you know, like the Better Buses for Strathclyde campaign and Get Glasgow Moving. It really is grassroots led. That's where the urgency seems to be coming from. So who are the champions in government that are really taking this forward? We've talked about the delay in guidance, but what really is causing the delay here? Do we need to amend the legislation?
No, I mean, and on the basis about delay, it hasn't stopped Scottish, you know, the Strathclyde Partnership proposing, you know, publishing their proposals. They've done that. That's good. That's a movement. That's, you know, in terms of our regional transport partnerships, the power is with them. I mean, unless you're wanting to have a command and control over the bus system in Scotland, then, you know, you have to, you know, provide the legislation, which we've done, the statutory instruments, which we've done. We're ahead of the UK in terms of where they are, in terms of the investment, in terms of the spending review. What I've been told is that any funding won't be available to 2007-8 in terms of where they are. So the idea that somehow something's happening immediately elsewhere and somehow we're behind, I don't think is the case. We're ahead of many other parts of the UK, both in terms of our legislation and our statutory instruments. The guidance, I've shared my frustration. I think the guidance is needed. That will be helpful. But in terms of your assertion about other regional transport partnerships, I'd be very interested to hear if there's other regional transport partnerships that are wanting to pursue franchising specifically. I know there's a number of regional transport partnerships that would look to other forms within the legislation, bus partnerships, etc. So I'm not aware of that issue. So if there's a regional transport partnership that's come to you saying that they are wanting to move ahead with franchising and they haven't done so, then I'd be very keen to hear about that, because the one that I know is very keen is SPT. They're driving that forward. And of course, as you say, that's the whole of Strathclyde. So that's a number of councils that they have to take with them on delivery.
Yeah, and that's really positive, and I certainly commend SPT, but I think this has happened at a time when there's been uncertainty. You know, we've heard about guidance that's delayed not by 1 year but by 6 years. So from where I'm sitting, it feels like today we're getting a lot of spin from the government that Scotland's way ahead of everyone else, when actually, when we speak to constituents, grassroots campaigners, transport bodies, regionally, they're saying that we are behind. So,
well, I don't know
like
whether,
disconnect here, Cabinet
I'm not
Secretary.
sure where these obviously campaigners will want to campaign. That's what campaigners do. I mean, the idea is 6 years out of date. I think, Monica, you're maybe perhaps stretching things. The legislation was passed by this Parliament.
No, a 6 year delay, a delay in the guidance.
It was the legislation, right? The legislation enabling franchising was passed by this Parliament in 2019, which was good. The statutory instruments that were required to put everything else in place have come through this Parliament and are already delivered. That's a good thing. In terms of the choices that are available to local authorities and regional transport partnerships, particularly Strathclyde Partnership Transport have done their work, and I had a presentation from them at the last regional transport partnership as to what they were proposing. They've got agreement from all the local authorities. That's a strong position to be in, but they have to do it in a way that is robust, that doesn't leave them in a situation, as happened elsewhere, where there's legal challenge from private operators who don't want to cooperate, and that's a very real risk indeed. So they're very conscious of what they need to do. But I think you're criticising, and campaigners are criticising, Strathclyde Partnership Transport mistakenly, when they've actually produced what they want them to produce, which is a blueprint to take them forward.
No, just to be clear, I don't think the campaigners that I mentioned are criticising SPT. I think they've welcomed the recent progress. Convener, I think I will hand back to you, because I think we've got different perspectives on this today, but just for absolute clarity, because I know Mark Ruskell covered this in his questions, but when will this statutory guidance be published? So can we get a date?
So I can't give you a date, because the consultation will be with people that need to be consulted with, which is the CMA, and also with the Office of Traffic Commissioner, and also because it will be published in draft with the local authorities and the RTPs who want to use it to make sure it's got everything that they want in it as well. So obviously when we have a date, we'll give it to you. I understand the frustrations, but the idea that somehow this is holding things up, quite clearly it hasn't. It will be helpful for implementation, but as I've not heard that there's any other RTP that you've said is concerned about this issue. So you're an SPT have gone ahead with theirs, so I'm not quite sure where that is, but I'm happy to move on to other areas.
I'll hand back to the convener. I mean, I think the key things we want to see the franchising actually being implemented.
Yes.
Like right now, you know, there's been some progress, but it still hasn't become reality. So I think these dates are important, and I'll hand back to you, convener.
Thanks, Monica. Bob, you wanted to ask some questions.
Yeah, thanks, convener. I hope that when we saying at the start, the best way that MSPs can support bus services to actually use them. And as a non-driver and someone who uses buses frequently with my family in Glasgow, that's the best way we can support them, drive patronage up and not down. But I want to look at specifically SPT and their proposal. My understanding is their new strategy was published just last month in September, which included progressing with franchising, and they plan to have costings around that in December this year. So that would look as if their plans are on track. But I've also seen it reported that the annual cost, not the set-up costs, but the annual running costs of franchising could be up to £85 million from some SPT projections, as low as £45 million per year. So a massive range in costings, a massive range of what expectations of what franchising may actually look like in practice. And I think one commercial operator speculated it could be hundreds of millions of pounds per year. So my question, Cabinet Secretary, is we get the process as robust as we like, as detailed as we like, as protective against legal challenges as we like, but if the money's not there to deliver it, it ain't going to happen. And that's a collective endeavour, getting the money. That SPT have progressed with this, but there's lots of other partners, of which one is the Scottish Government. Has there been any discussions, Cabinet Secretary, on how any of this might be funded going forward?
So, as you said, they haven't come up with their figures as to what they anticipate in terms of it being able to publish with ministers, certainly. Yep. But obviously that's going to be part of their engagement. But it has to be an ownership and decision by the Regional Transport Partnership, and obviously the Regional Transport Partnership is made up of all the local authorities within the Strathclyde area, and they would have to look at the costings of this, and that they're not there yet, I think is how I would describe it.
Okay, I mean, I get the complexities, because franchising to one local authority may look very different from another, and SPT is trying to shepherd this in a way that is strategic and robust and has a clear business plan. But has there been any discussions at all between government and COSLA or local authorities or SPT about what potential future costings and financing of this might look like at all?
Well, I don't have any bus officials with me because we thought we were going to go into other areas. Okay. I thought we were going to finish by now, but I know there might be other areas you want to go into. So I haven't had those discussions with SPT, and obviously I lead on the budget areas. So unless and until we have a business plan and what they're set out, or even an ask, it's very difficult to say. Again, it's all hypothetical, but then they can't do that until they've come up with their own plans in terms of costed plans.
I think that's perfectly reasonable. I just wanted to put on record that we have the process perfect, but if there's no money to fund it, then it ain't going to happen anyway.
Well,
thank you.
I mean, I think everybody wants Strathclyde to be able to do what they want to be able to do in a positive way.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Well, we're definitely not finished yet, Cabinet Secretary, because we're coming on to a very important subject close to my heart, which you're going to not have to guess, which is ferries. So, the committee met on the 19th of September with Peel Ports to discuss various matters, including the issues at Ardrossan. What was clear at that meeting is, or was clear to me at that meeting, was that the information that I'd been led to believe in the Parliament, that Peel Ports was frustrating the purchase of Ardrossan, just frankly wasn't true. Could you just confirm to me that the government on 2 occasions have delayed the purchase of Ardrossan Harbour on the basis they were still trying to figure out whether it was Troon or Ardrossan that should be the base for the ferry? Or was it just on one occasion? But we were told
that's not true. Since I came into office which is well over 2 years ago. I can categorically say that that has not been the Scottish Government's position. We have wanted to see investment in Ardrossan. I've been clear about that, and that's my commitment. I don't know what's happened previously. Peel Ports may have been referring to something previously. I don't recognise the reflection. Obviously, there are two sides to any negotiation. This is a live negotiation. Both parties to that negotiation will want to advance their own position, and until such time as that negotiation is settled, I wouldn't want to say anything that would prejudice that negotiation.
I don't think it's going to prejudice the discussions over the purchase of the port if you clarified whether, prior to your time as Cabinet Secretary, whether there was any discussions or whether it should be Trunard Ardrossan. Because we also heard that Peel Ports had offered to invest in Ardrossan to the tune of £170 million-ish for the improvements to the quayside to allow a 102-metre ferry into the harbour for a berth that was only 97 metres. Is that true or is that not true?
I don't recognise what you're saying, Convener. One of the challenges we have had with Ardrossan when it was, because remember originally it was meant to be only the Council and Peel Ports that were to carry out the investment. There were obviously challenges for them in doing so, and that was one of the issues when then eventually the Scottish Government came in as part of that partnership in the task force. But of course the issue is if to get the full investment that's required, the level of investment would be substantial, and I don't think there was ever a position that Peel Ports were going to invest in the full totality of the level of investment that would have been required at that point, which is always the challenge because it's a private harbour. I don't know, Chris Wilcott has been around a bit longer than I have, so do you want to reflect on this, Chris?
So you can reflect on both of the issues if you've been around longer than the Cabinet. Sorry, Cabinet Secretary, I think it's entirely appropriate that I ask these questions because the committee undertook a visit and we were given specific information. And if that information is not correct, that's quite serious as far as I'm concerned as a convener of the committee. But Chris, happy to hear from you.
So certainly from my involvement, the consideration around Trunard Ardrossan happened way back when that original decision was then taken to retain Ardrossan.
So there was a discussion on whether Trunard Ardrossan...
I'm trying to remember, was there not an issue around probably way back in the late 2017-18 with when Hamza Yousaf was probably the Transport Minister, when there was a question mark about the issue. I remember at that point there was work carried out and a commitment made, I think even at that time, by Hamza Yousaf, that Ardrossan was to be the place where the ferries would operate from. So, I mean, that's quite historic. And all I'm saying is I'm the person that is given the commitment that we will purchase the harbour to ensure we get the investments that we need.
Okay, I'd be interested to hear Chris's point that he was about to make.
So absolutely, from that original point, I think 2015, 2016, when ministers were involved in looking at the two options and the decision was made to retain Ardrossan, as the Cabinet Secretary has also articulated there was an assumption that would be funded entirely by Peel Ports and North Ayrshire Council. That project changed over time, the scope increased, at which point Scottish Government funding was being discussed. And since that point in time, we've been trying to get to a point where we had agreed all of those funding streams and the legal agreements that sat around about them. And in more recent times, just before the Cabinet Secretary's announcement, we were getting to the point where it was looking like that wasn't going to be able to be achieved. That funding package was not possible to make that stack up. This suggestion, certainly I don't recognise at all any suggestion of 170 million from Peel Ports as an investment. I think they had said they could have reopened the package, which, as I was saying, but that would have resulted in additional charges. They would have had to recoup that in some way. So that original proposal was no longer possible, which is why we've moved our focus on the purchase.
Okay, and the other thing that we heard when we were there, when we met with Peel Ports, is the heads of terms have been agreed for the purchase of Ardrossan, and it was just a question of transferring the money across and it became the Scottish Government's port. Is that the case or not the case?
The reports from CMAL, who are obviously negotiating on our behalf as appropriate body to do so, is that they're well advanced in terms of that discussion about heads of terms. Clearly, in terms of the final agreement, some of this property hasn't, the assets haven't been, had any transactions since the 19th century. We want to make sure that the detail of that is all provided for. So we need to make sure that it's, and I think Peel reflect that themselves, that this needs to be done properly and negotiated in a way that actually delivers a good contract, and that's what we're proposing. And why is this important? Is because there is a limit to what the Scottish Government can invest in any private organisation, our limit of about 60.
Cabinet Secretary, I'm not disputing that.
Okay,
what I was
right.
trying to work out was that we were very much told the heads of terms had been agreed. I have done purchases of land in my past, in my previous profession, and it can be done quite quickly. My question was, if the price is agreed, I'm not asking what the price is, if it was agreed today, do you have the money to buy it tomorrow? Could it transfer that quickly? Because that's normally the way it works.
So it will be ready when it's ready in terms of that detail on the heads of terms are in a good place. So therefore, in terms of the transfer of funding, as I reported to this committee, that I had secured funding in this year's budget to ensure the price and to ensure the purchase of Ardrossan Harbour. Okay. Final question then. You might not recognise the figure of 170 million, which was what was the figure that was quoted from some time ago, that Peel Ports thought it would cost to increase the size of the pier to take a bigger boat than had moored there before. You will have done, as part of your costings for buying the port, a cost for doing the repairs and regeneration required at Ardrossan as part of the business case. What's it going to cost the people of Scotland to get the port fit to take a ferry that was ordered over 9 years ago? So it's important that there is immediate work carried out. So there'll be short-term work for the immediate use, particularly of the Caledonian Isles. I'm sure people will be pleased that the Caledonian Isles has returned. There'll also be medium-term and longer-term aspects. So one of the issues was the bare basics may have been done previously, whereas we think there needs to be more extensive work to ensure that the port will be in a good place for longer term. So I'm not going to give you, because prices will have changed. That's one of the issues of the work of the task force, was revisiting the different prices that were coming forward at that time. And obviously, in terms of the business case development, we are aware of the degree and level, but it depends on the different stages. It will be a staged work that will have to take place at Ardrossan. Okay, pushing on that slightly, if I may, Cabinet Secretary, if you're doing a commercial deal, part of the commercial deal recognises the amount you're going to have to invest in the assets to make it work. I'm not convinced that you've got those figures in front of you, or do you have them to hand? They would have been put forward at the business case development would authorise the funding to go forward. So, I mean, I'll try and give you I'll try and come back to the committee with as up-to-date figures as we understand for the development, but there's different aspects to the harbour, as you'll be aware. I would accept short, medium and long-term plans for capital investments, but you will still have a base price for each of those at the time that you're putting it forward, the business case, based on today's figure with an inflationary potential rise for future years. That's the way it would be done commercially. So I'd be very grateful if you could provide that information. Douglas Lumsden, you've got some questions, and then I'm going to go to the Deputy Convener.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I was just going to ask, obviously last week, the sole islander on the board of CMAL was ousted, Murdo McClellan. Just wondered if you had any more details you could share with us, Cabinet Secretary, on why he was removed, and is there plans now for another islander to be on the board?
Well, absolutely. It's really important that we have islanders on the board of our organisation, so that will happen. I don't recognise your terms. I think, as everybody understands, the board appointments are done in accordance with the ethical standards and all the rest of it, and they're quite clear that the reappointments cannot be assumed by anybody, and it's important that the board reflects what's needed at that time, both in personnel and in other areas. So yes, there will be an advertisement very soon, I would hope, to ensure that we continue with island representation.
But it was reported that he was due to have another term, and this was changed. Is this not the case?
Can I just say, I think issues around board appointments are normally confidential. I don't know in terms of who's reported what and when. I would be concerned, and not least for the individual, that if there's been any rumour or gossip that has turned out in reports. So I don't think that's fair to characterise it that way.
Okay, but it was reported in the BBC that he's maybe raised concerns about civil servants going from Edinburgh for a launch, and then after that his recommended for reapproval was withdrawn. So was that not the case?
So, I mean, the BBC can sometimes get things incorrect, not least when they, in fact, quite seriously said that there was a failure to complete sea trials for the MV Isla, which was very serious, so we had to kind of get that amended. Can I tell you, I don't actually have any civil servants in Edinburgh. My civil servants are based in Glasgow. That's one factual inaccuracy. And the formal invite was given to a well-respected and well-known islander to carry out that function. I'm glad she did. I think also speculation kind of diminishes her role. So I think that kind of, can I just say, I think gossip should not end up in terms of reports that I end up getting asked about. So I will stick with the ethical standards and commission and the correct way to go about these things.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Deputy Convener, you've got some questions.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on the issue around Ardrossan Harbour and Peel Ports and their behaviour around this, who are clearly seeking to get as much taxpayers' money as they can for an asset that they've probably invested nothing in for the last couple of decades beyond the odd essential bit of work. Can you inform the committee, have Peel Ports provided CMA with full access to the data bank for the port in order to ensure that any sale of the asset is a clean sale of the asset, with no small bits of ransom strip being held by Peel Ports to return and to try and get more taxpayer money out of us at some point at a later date?
So I'm going to be cautious because this is a live negotiation. I want it to be successful, so I'm not going to pass any comment. Members can, but I'm going to be as objective as I can in terms of where we are. We're, as discussed with the convener, we're in a good place in terms of where we are with the Heads of Terms Agreement. Yes, there is access to the data bank. Yes, in terms of what I think would be desirable is a clean approach that allows no hangovers that can be problematic in the future, which is the detail that I think needs to get finalised before any purchase can take place. But I think that your analysis is correct in terms of why that's important, and that's part of the detailed negotiations that are going on just now.
And are Peel Port committed to a full clean sale of the asset?
I think there's a desirable outcome. I'm not going to comment on two negotiating bodies when there's a live negotiation going on.
Yeah. I would find it hard to believe why Peel Port would not want to facilitate a clean sale, but we'll leave it there.
Okay, just looking around to see if there's any other questions. As the last question, or the last series of questions, Cabinet Secretary, can I ask you to cast your mind back to June 2023, which is, I think, just before you became a Cabinet Secretary, and you were part of this committee indeed, and this committee produced a report on the 26th of June, a modern sustainable ferry service for Scotland, which I'm sure you remember. I would draw your attention to paragraph 193, which says there's a widespread agreement that the current tripartite arrangement for managing Scots Government ferries is not working effectively for for the Clyde and Hebrides and is not adequately serving dependent communities. Change is needed. It goes on to say that the committee recommends in paragraph 198 the Scottish Government should give consideration to CMAL Transport Scotland merger to create a Ferry Scotland as an arm of Transport Scotland. This could streamline decision-making. That followed on from a report from the REC Committee, I think in 2020, saying that the tripartite agreement wasn't working. What are you doing about it, Cabinet Secretary?
Making sure in the meantime it has been working, and I think to reflect the importance of all those parties working together, I think they have done in a constructive way. Can I also say that in terms of, and I think that's been identified by those that work with the combination and, in fact, the joint working and physically joint working in terms of the consultations that have taken place physically, CMAL, GALMAC and Transport Scotland officials all coming together with one voice, I think is really important. It has been a busy year in relation to ferries, not least obviously the commissioning and procurement of almost a third of the fleet. CalMac, as I've recognised, has now got a direct award. A lot of work involved from both Transport Scotland colleagues and also CalMac in the production of that. I've always said that I would be open to a change in governance arrangements. I think had it been done in the 2 years since I came into post, that would have disrupted what has been a really important period of intense work with everyone. I would point out that although I was a member of this committee and took evidence extensively on the Ferries Committee, in fact, I remember Monica Lennon and I going to the Western Isles, which was very informative, together, and so this was before you even joined the committee. I did.
No, it wasn't.
The Ferries Committees.
No, it wasn't. I took part in that inquiry as well, Cabinet
I know
Secretary.
you did. No, but it actually started with your predecessor. Right. Sorry, it started. It was quite a long inquiry, but
we've had more focused ones since. Cabinet
have you?
I'm
sure you have. Well, I wasn't convener at the time, but there you are. But well, I think probably for the record, I need to recognise that although I took part in all the evidence sessions, I wasn't involved in the final drafting of that ferry report, which was a very good ferry report. And I was going to say to the convener, a lot of the recommendations that were in that report are now evident in the award that's just been presented. And I know we gave you a letter explaining that, but we've actually gone through point by point on some of the things that you'd recommended as a committee that has now seen effect. And actually, I think I've said this before, and I'll say it again, I strongly believe in the parliamentary committee system of this Parliament, and I think this is a good example where quite a number of recommendations from this committee's report have been realised in the delivery of the ferries contract.
Okay, so am I getting the impression that you don't think CMAL's time is up yet?
I think the function of CMAL is absolutely essential in terms of the governance arrangements and whether that can be done by bringing different bodies together. I am, and have said I am open to that. We're now in a position that it's more, I think, readily available where we are now to consider how that, now we've got the direct award, at least for one of those partners, to consider what we might want to do going forward. So I'm not closing that option. And indeed, it might be a more appropriate time to look at it going forward than it has certainly been over the last 2 years.
Okay, so just to enable us to look at it, or continue to look at it, Cabinet Secretary, one of the issues was that CMAL hold CalMac's pensions, and there's problems with that. I think there's a pension deficit for CalMac, which was agreed was a problem as far as merging CMAL within Transport Scotland. Are you sorting that out so CalMac become responsible for their own pensions?
Well, there is a serious issue right across government that we need to make sure that all pension schemes by public bodies are in a good state. And I used to work in pensions a long, long time ago, and I'm also conscious that with any governance and organisation, and my advice has always been, I sort of merged some of the first organisations back in 2007, 8, 9 period, is that you need to get pensions sorted for everybody's, because the security of security of employment, security of pensions are absolutely vital for any organisation. And the last thing you want to do, especially when they're busy procuring a third of our fleet and doing extremely good work negotiating our Drossen and other aspects, is you need to make sure you look after your staff, you look after your people, and you give them confidence in the future.
I totally agree. My point is that they're holding pensions that are the responsibility of CalMac, as I understand it, and there's a deficit in there. And I'm asking you if that's going to be resolved in the short term.
So I don't want to go into too much detail, but I think the system, the situation has improved, right? But it doesn't mean that there still isn't an issue that I'm very conscious you have to look at. So are you testing, am I aware of the different things that matter in terms of any future arrangement? The answer is yes, including the pensions.
Good, because they probably won't be resolved before I leave this Parliament. So it's on the record that I've at least tried to get it resolved, Cabinet Secretary. Unless there's any other questions from the committee, that brings the end this session on transport. It has gone on slightly longer, Cabinet Secretary, than I think you anticipated, but that's probably to the fact of the huge, wide-ranging portfolio that you have, and I don't think the committee can be blamed for that. So we are going to move into looking at UK subordinate legislation. And so before we do that, I am going to briefly suspend, because it's been slightly longer, and ask the committee to reconvene here at 11:55. Thank you, and I suspend the meeting.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, welcome back to this meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. Our third item on the agenda is the consideration of a consent notification relating to the proposed UK statutory instrument, the Producer Responsibility Obligations Packaging and Packaging Waste Amendment Regulations 2025. The instrument would amend the Producer Responsibility Obligations Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulations 2024. We took evidence on these on the 3rd of September last year. The amendments would enable the appointment of a producer responsibility organisation. This involves the UK Government legislating in a devolved area. The Scottish Government has said it is content with the UK Government doing so in this case, and the reasons for that are set out in the notification we've received. The committee's role is to decide whether it agrees with the Scottish Government about this. We can express a view both on whether we agree in principle to the UK Government legislating in this area and whether we agree with the specific manner which it proposes to do. If we consent to be given, I will write to the Scottish Government accordingly. In writing to the Scottish Government, we also have the option to draw any matters to the Government's attention, pose questions or ask to be kept up to date on particular matters. Of course, if we're not content, we can make one or two recommendations. My question to you is, does any member have any views on this that they wish to express? I'm looking at committee members. There's no views. So these ones. It was suggested in our meeting notes, and maybe a couple of questions, if we're content to agree, we could actually pose as well, which were what functions of the scheme administrator may be delegated to the new PRO and how the governance of the PRO will reflect and ensure consideration of Scottish interests and circumstances, and whether the proposed changes to the modelling of local authority costs are expected to significantly impact the estimates of what funds will be made available to Scottish local authorities, and whether COSLA has raised any concerns. They seem relevant questions that we might want to pose, but it doesn't affect the fact that we're probably saying at the end of the day that we agree to this. So, are we content? Well, I'll move the substantive question. Is the committee content that the provisions set out in the notification should be made to the proposed UK statutory instrument? The answer seems to be yes. Are you happy that we raise those questions that are put in the paper? So we'll do that as well. And we'll write to the Scottish Government. Just to clarify, I think we're about to go into recess, but just to say that is the committee happy that I sign off the letter on behalf of the committee to the Scottish Government based on that? Okay. Our next item of business is consideration of a negative SI, the Motor Vehicles Competitions and Trials Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Regulations 2025. They always get snappier, these titles. This is laid under the negative procedure, which means that it will come into force unless the Parliament agrees to a motion to annul it, and no motion has been lodged. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has drawn the instrument to the Parliament's attention under reporting ground 1, defective drafting, and also under the general reporting ground in respect of 2 further points. The defective drafting relates to how different types of motor vehicle events are regulated. The DPLR committee noted that races or trials of speed are authorised and regulated under one set of regulations, the motorsports regulations, whereas other types of competitions and trials are regulated under the competitions regulations. This instrument amends the competitions regulations by designating 4 rallies as specific events. The government has now acknowledged that it was the motorsports regulations that should have been used, and they've said they intend to bring forward an amending regulations. Sorry, that's a mouthful. They intend to bring forward amending regulations urgently. The DPLR has also reported 2 or more drafting issues. The first rally is misnamed in the instrument as the Scottish Government has now acknowledged and has taken to correct it by amending the instrument. It was called the Robert Albert Clark rally rather than the Roger Albert Clark rally. The second committee queried the use of public way instead of public highway. The Scottish Government says it considers the drafting to be clear, but will reflect further on whether greater consistency would be preferable. Does any member have any comments on the instruments? So, if there's no comments, I would invite the committee to agree that it does not wish to make any further recommendations in relation to the instrument, but acknowledge those of the DPLR committee. Is everyone happy with that? Yes, thank you. And again, I will sign the letter off relating to that. We'll now move into private, and I'll just again put on the record that Monica Lennon will not take part in item 7, and we expect the Labour Party substitute Sarah Byatt to attend in her place. And we now move into private session. Thank you.